Chapter 591. But before that, he still wanted to see how far his sword formation could go. The sword formation whistled, resonating with the stars. The three cultivators felt as if they were bearing all the pressure, as if the flying swords in the air would fall at any moment, destroying the world. They were unstoppable. This was an illusion. The sword formation was accumulating power. The sword formation needed to accumulate power. It wasn't like how he had dealt with Wei Yan in the South Sea, where the sword formation had immediately gathered power and slashed out. Because he wasn't facing one person now, but three. The sword formation had gathered power into a single sword. When the sword slashed down, it meant that the other 6 flying swords had temporarily lost their ability to move. He couldn't use the heavenly sword ruler, nor could he separate from the sword formation to protect his master, because their power had been transferred to the flying sword that had struck out through the sword formation. But he was facing 3 opponents now. If he fought against them, he might be able to kill one of them, but he would be reduced to ashes by the other 2. So he had to accumulate power. He had to seize the opportunity. He had to create psychological pressure on his opponents. As long as one of them lost their balance, he would have an opportunity. Lu Xiaoyi also hoped that his opponents would fight against his sword formation, looking for an opportunity to attack and defend. Only by fighting would he have a chance. But the 3 Taoists' 3 purities were extremely experienced. They wouldn't attack easily, but instead stood together, waiting for his sword to land. Waiting for him to land, he couldn't land. This was the subtlety of battle. Unless he used the sword formation to continue grinding without gathering power. The result of this was that his defense would increase by a level, but the strength of his attacks wouldn't increase qualitatively. It could only be said that with the threat of the condensed sword strike, his opponents would hesitate to attack. The weakness was also very obvious. He would lose the flexibility to control the sword. This was the fundamental difference between controlling the sword and controlling the sword. It couldn't be said to be good or bad. Different environments had different applications. It could only be said that after Lu Xiaoyi's heavy sword lost its threat, the combination of tactics he could choose was greatly limited by the fact that he had 3 opponents. This wasn't strange. An early Jin Dan swordsman could easily crush 3 peak Jin Dan cultivators from the strongest Taoist sects in the cultivation world. This was illogical. Lu Xiaoyi sighed in his heart. Reality had proven that the sword formation was not omnipotent. Under the difference in strength, it was impossible for there to be an omnipotent sword technique. This was a problem that he had to solve in the future. How could he achieve a perfect, natural, and accurate switch between sword manipulation and sword play? The sword formation surrounded him and began to attack according to the Big Dipper star formation. He wisely chose to attack separately, and reserved the right to gather his sword and attack at any time. This was the most suitable method at the moment. In the blink of an eye, the flying swords and the spells of the Dharma cultivators began an intense battle. However, Lu Xiaoyi's attacks were even more resolute than before. He was trying his best to find a loophole in the trio's teamwork and find a breakthrough point. Gentle Breeze could sense the change in swordsmen. He knew that he could not wait any longer. A single-person sword formation would never have a systematic problem. But when 3 people worked together, there would definitely be problems. Even if the 3 of them had been friends for hundreds of years and came from the same origin, they were not the same person. As time passed, there would definitely be a time when there would be a mistake in their teamwork. He hoped that this would be a complete victory. He did not want any of his fellow disciples to die here. He secretly took out a jade bottle from his hand. However, he did not throw it at his opponent. Instead, he threw it into the sea below him. His seemingly aimless throw made Lu Xiaoyi frown. Others might not know, but he knew very well what was hidden under the Imperial Oyster Reef. This was also the reason why he had brought the 3 of them here. However, this was not the original plan. His body slammed into the water and was about to rush up, but he was firmly held down by the 3 Dharma cultivators. They did not care about the consequences because they knew what their fellow disciple had thrown down. both sides only knew half of the situation. Lu Xiaoyi knew the actual situation under the sea, while the three pure ones knew the details of the bottle. If they gathered together, what would happen? The jade bottle fell very quickly. Lu Xiaoyi could not free his hands to stop it. He watched as it sank into the sea. Immediately, a whirlpool appeared on the surface of the sea. It quickly formed a waterspout and sucked Lu Xiaoyi in the sky. The strongest spiritual weapon of the three pure ones could only be used in places where there were rivers and seas. The stronger the water, the better the effect. The most suitable place was the sea. The jade bottle was not famous, but the natural phenomenon after it was thrown into the sea was very famous: the dragon's breath of the azure sea. It was a huge waterspout, like the neck of a long-necked dragon. Its body was under the sea, and its long neck was thousands of feet above the surface of the sea, waiting for an opportunity to suck people in. This was a sub-precious weapon whose power was close to that of a precious weapon. It was the pinnacle of the three pure ones' weapon manufacturing technology. Under the dragon's breath, no Jin Dan cultivator could resist, regardless of their cultivation level. The waterspout's target was obviously Lu Xiaoyi. He was thousands of feet above the sea, but he was still unable to resist the powerful suction force. Before the waterspout even got close to him, the suction force had already controlled the entire battlefield. Not only him, but the three pure ones cultivators were also affected. Gentle Breeze frowned. This jade bottle did not belong to him, nor did it belong to any of the three pure Jin Dan cultivators. It was a public property of the sect. Anyone who needed it could borrow it from the sect temporarily. The purpose of their trip this time was only to communicate with the Five Elements sect of the Eastern Sea. They did not know that there would be a battle. The reason why they brought this jade bottle was because the Five Elements sect had heard of the dragon's breath of the Azure Sea and wanted to see it for themselves. If such a request was made by other sects, it would be meaningless. However, since the Five Elements sect was inextricably linked to the three pure ones, their request had to be fulfilled. They were not asking for the jade bottle, but just to see its effects. Before they could demonstrate it on the spot, they already knew about the arrival of the Xianyuan swordsman. This was the reason why they were so confident. With their positioning technique, at least in the Eastern Sea, with the help of the Five Elements sect, it would not be difficult to locate the swordsman on land. Why did they let him go out to sea? Why did they let him leave the coastal waters? The most important factor was that the deeper the sea, the more powerful the dragon's breath of the Azure Sea would be. If a cultivator was caught by the dragon's breath, he would be torn apart by the water pressure in the waterspout. He would not be able to use any mystic techniques. If his body was not tough enough, he would probably die on the spot. Even if he could hold on and escape in the end, most of his abilities would be gone. How could he survive being surrounded by three people? It was a perfect strategy. This was the reason why they were not in a hurry to make a move themselves. Three peak Jin Dan cultivators had to use this kind of inferior treasure to deal with an early Jin Dan cultivator. This in itself showed that they were afraid of the swordsman. If the swordsman died in the Yellow Springs, he should be proud of himself. The only small surprise was that the waterspout's attractive force was a little too strong. It actually faintly enveloped the three of them. Was this a normal phenomenon? Seeing the gazes of his two junior brothers, Gentle Breeze smiled indifferently. It's fine. Just relax. The jade bottle has already located the swordsman. There's no mistake. It's just that the dragon's breath of the Azure Sea is boundless and cannot be condensed. This is also a common problem with watertight forbidden techniques. It's not strange at all. He did not speak the truth because he had never used the dragon's breath of the Azure Sea before. But at this moment, as the senior brother in charge, what else could he say? Could he say that he had never used it before and didn't know? Could he just leave it up to fate? Chapter 592. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't break free from the suction force. The best time for him to escape was when Gentle Breeze threw the bottle into the sea. Unfortunately, even though he had anticipated it, and was vigilant, he was still a second too late under the desperate suppression of the 3 spell cultivators. By the time he removed the sword formation and prepared to use his flying sword to break free from the suppression, it was already too late. The dragon breath of the azure sea was already formed. Before the water dragon could reach the sky, a majestic wave of water completely enveloped the combat airspace. The only way to solve this problem was to have a deep understanding of the 5 elements. But he couldn't do it now. This wasn't his plan. His plan was to borrow a Bayan under the Imperial Oyster Reef. Bayan, a strange creature among sea beasts. It was an insect in the sea and a fish in the sea. It was a natural amphibious creature. The king among them could cultivate to become a demon on its own. When Lu Xiui passed by this reef on his way here, he happened to find this demon giving birth in the reef. Because the little Bayan after giving birth would exclusively feed on the carcass of the Imperial Oyster Reef, this Imperial Oyster Reef was the best place for Bayan to give birth. There was no need to worry about food, and a few more Bayan who couldn't protect themselves when they were young could survive. Bayans weren't like lactating animals, where the big ones would take care of the small ones and wait for them to grow up and have the ability to survive on their own. They were essentially no different from ordinary sea beasts. They gave birth to thousands of Bayan at a time. As for how many would survive, it was up to the unpredictable risks of the sea. After giving birth, a female Bayan would rest in the Imperial Oyster Reef for a few days and eat the Imperial Oyster Reef to make up for the loss of her body. This was also the only time a female Bayan would have the radiance of a mother. After her body recovered, she would leave the Imperial Oyster Reef and let her offspring fend for themselves. Lu Xiaoyi's plan was to lure the spell cultivators to attack here. He would lower his body to the surface of the sea and let his spells hit the reef to anger the usually docile Bayan. Any creature in the period of giving birth was irritable and easily angered. If they were disturbed at this time, the consequences could be imagined. He could then benefit from the side. He was certain that Bayan could control the 3 Dharma practitioners because it was a rare Yuanying beast. Everything went smoothly in the beginning, but something unexpected happened in the end. The Dharma cultivators attacked first, and a dragon of the ocean's breath was enough to make him lose control of himself. The key question was whether such a commotion would be enough to alert the Tao Wu hiding under the sea. If he was the only one who was sucked in by the dragon breath without alerting Tao Wu, then it would be a huge problem. He would have to use his life to make up for his miscalculation. Swordsmen, other than the sword, do not believe in anything else. You can have a plan, but you can't rely on it. This was Lu Xiaoyi's final conclusion before he was sucked into the waterspout. However, Gentle Breeze did not have the time to appreciate Swordsman's pitiful state. The 3 of them were also in a predicament. This wasn't a pure azure sea dragon breath. There were other things hidden in the waterspout. Was it a coincidence? Or was it Swordsman's plan? They didn't have time to figure it out. The 3 of them unleashed their spells at the same time, attacking the waterspout. However, they couldn't stop themselves from being sucked into the waterspout. The 3 of them were shocked to find that there was another huge mouth inside the waterspout. It was a mouth full of sharp teeth, red cavity walls, and 2 cold, dead fish eyes that emitted an uncontrollable murderous intent. They couldn't even tell what kind of sea beast it was. This guy had hidden himself inside the waterspout, leaving only his mouth outside. Tao Wu had a space. To be precise, it wasn't a space, but its stomach pouch. When it swallowed food, it would expand greatly, and it would have a small space. This was why sea beasts could last for several years. The cultivation of sea beasts was different from that of humans. No matter what realm they were at, they wouldn't refuse to eat. Moreover, their appetite was huge. As time passed, their stomach pouch became extremely tough. With the nourishment of Yuanying's elemental energy, they could easily swallow a Jing Dan beast. Most of the time, they didn't even need to chew and just relied on their stomach to digest. This was a rather powerful ability of sea beasts. When fighting with humans, sea beasts would often transform into their true forms and swallow their opponents in one gulp. In fact, they relied on their abnormal stomach pouch ability. Lu Shi was the first to be swallowed. He secretly complained in his heart. Tao Wu's stomach pouch couldn't be empty. It was a clean place. Imagine the situation inside a human's stomach pouch. Sea beast stomach pouches were essentially the same. The only difference was that humans mainly ate grains, while this guy only ate seafood. It was filled with viscous gastric juices, undigested beast bones, and all kinds of strange things. The gastric juices were extremely corrosive, and with the addition of the sea beast's elemental energy, there weren't many things in this world that they couldn't digest. If a cultivator was inside, they wouldn't die. As long as they put up a layer of protective aura around them, they would be able to barely hold on. After all, cultivators didn't have the problem of suffocation. However, a human's elemental energy wasn't endless. This place was isolated from the outside world of spiritual vigor. Without replenishment, it was only a matter of time before the cultivator died. Lu Xiaoyi tried. Because the stomach pouch was a mutated small space, it belonged to the sea beast's natural ability. A person inside it couldn't open their storage ring. In other words, the countless pills in the storage ring could only be looked at, but couldn't be used. This was the human's own trap. Which cultivator didn't keep their personal belongings in their storage ring? Who would keep them in their pockets? Similarly, the flying sword couldn't come out. This wasn't the sword spirit's problem, this was the sword case's problem. It was suppressed by Tao Wu's small space, and the flying sword had lost its exit. This was the suppression of space, and also the suppression of cultivation level. This made Lu Xiaoyi very disappointed. He realized this problem. If he could survive, he swore that he would create a sword case that even the gods couldn't break his sword path. He still had time. With his own elemental energy, he could maintain this protective aura barrier for at least a few days. It wouldn't be too long because of the corrosive gastric juices and the suppression of elemental energy. During this time, he had to find a way out. This was very difficult because he didn't have a sword. Not to mention a flying sword, he didn't even have a sword in his hand. He could only use his bare hands. This was also the reason why many sea beasts dared to devour. In their stomach pouches, all items based on space were restricted. There was no possibility of you holding a stick in the stomach of a sea beast and turning the sky upside down. He couldn't see, he couldn't hear, his divine sense couldn't penetrate more than a few feet, and his spirit couldn't reach far. In the viscous gastric juices, he couldn't use the stellar escape, so he could only swim. Thankfully, the stomach pouch wasn't so big that he couldn't reach it even if he swam for a lifetime. After an hour, he came into contact with the wall of Tao Wu's stomach. It was an indescribable feeling. It was like a layer of rubber covered with thick grease. It was soft to the touch, but incomparably tough and slippery. Not to mention using his fists, even if he really had a sword in his hand, he might not be able to pierce through this layer of stomach wall. Lu Xiaoyi never thought that he would be in such a predicament. All of his cultivation experience couldn't help him. But he told himself not to panic. If people could come in, they could definitely come out. As long as he found the right way. P.S. I recommend a book. I only want to rely on myself. It's written well. Those who are interested can go and read it. Chapter 593. Lu Xiaoyi knew that he couldn't leave the stomach wall because he didn't know the direction. He had to rely on a base, so he could only follow the stomach wall. Since it was impossible to break through the stomach wall, where was the exit? There were only two, the esophagus that led to the mouth and the feces that led to the excretory opening. This was the common point of all living creatures, there was no exception. The advantage of going through the esophagus and finally going out through the big mouth of Tao Wu was that the distance would be shorter because the esophagus couldn't bend like the large intestines and small intestines. It should be a straight path. The trouble was with the mouth. What if Tao Wu didn't open its mouth? What if it opened its mouth and suddenly bit him when he passed through? Although he had physical skills, he didn't train himself into a small steel being. There was a high probability that he would be bitten into a sieve by Tao Wu's steel teeth, the feces path. The trouble was that the distance would be long. The large intestines and small intestines coiled in such a viscous mixture of liquid and solid would waste a lot of time. A human's intestines were usually 5 times the size of their height, so how long would this thing's intestines be? Because the intestines were much smaller than the stomach, he doubted whether he could swim out in the wriggling intestines. Of course, the last step might be easier. When he swam out of the last step, Tao Wu would definitely feel it and control its muscles to pinch him. Fortunately, there were no teeth here, so could he withstand it? Without much consideration, he decided to go down the path of the esophagus. This was probably the choice of most human cultivators. Humans needed to be innovative, but sometimes it was better to go with the flow. After deciding on Dafa's direction, the problem now was how to determine which direction led to the esophagus. He had to be calm. In this kind of place where he could only feel with his hands, once he panicked, he would definitely die. Lu Xiaoyi stood up while holding the stomach wall, imagining the shape of the stomach wall in his mind. Could it be cylindrical? Oval-shaped? Anyway, it couldn't be square or triangular. But there was a high probability that it would be an irregular oval. He had to first figure out which was the vertical axis and which was the horizontal axis. The result of taking the horizontal axis was that he would forever be circling in the stomach wall. This problem could be determined by the change in curvature of the stomach wall. If the curvature had a large change, it must be the horizontal axis, a closed circle. If the curvature had a small change, it must be the vertical axis. This required him to explore in all directions before he could make a final judgment. It wasn't difficult to determine the direction, but it required time. Lu Xiaoyi spent 2 hours to determine the general direction in the pitch-black stomach. It wasn't very accurate, and he might need to constantly adjust as he moved forward to avoid walking in a spiral. The next most important thing was how to differentiate which direction was the esophagus. Which direction was the fecal path? His method was very simple. Based on the freshness of the food in the stomach, the fresher direction was the direction of the esophagus. Those that had almost been digested were undoubtedly the direction of excretion. But first, he had to rely on his luck to choose a direction and see how lucky he was. If he was unlucky, he would move in the opposite direction. In this unlucky place, cultivation wasn't of much help to him. He had to rely more on his rigorous thinking and judgment. In the 4 hours since he entered, he didn't sense any traces of other humans falling in. But that didn't mean that those 3 people were outside. The stomach was huge, and the mucus was isolated from the outside. Bai Yan's Yuanying realm clearly suppressed them. He estimated that he wouldn't be able to sense someone casting a spell even if he was several dozen feet away, because spells wouldn't resonate with nature in this place. They would quickly disappear due to the roiling vital energy in the stomach. The worst-case scenario was that he would be caught red-handed by the 3 Taoist 3 purities waiting outside when he finally crawled out of Bai Yan's mouth. The possibility of that happening was very small, because the first to provoke Bai Yan was the jade bottle, not him, Lu Xiaoyi. Time passed by as Lu Xiaoyi groped his way forward. 4 hours later, the stench in the stomach became even thicker and putrid. He was finally certain that he was unlucky and had gone in the wrong direction. And so, he changed his direction and continued to grope around. This was a very depressing process, but fortunately, his mind was incomparably tough. He groped around for an entire day, adjusting his direction several times. He could feel the walls of the stomach contracting, which was a good sign. It meant that he wasn't far away from leaving the stomach. Then, he felt a bulge in his hand. It was a huge round bulge, just like an oversized manhole cover. It was completely different from the smooth and unwrinkled walls of the stomach. When a huge chunk of the Emperor Oyster's corpse suddenly surged in from this bulge, he was almost sent flying. This was Bai Yan eating. He had found the right place. But finding the right place didn't mean that he would be able to leave. Clearly, this bulge, which was several feet in diameter, was the equivalent of a check valve. It was the door to the esophagus. Every time it swallowed food, it would open. Normally, it would be tightly shut. However, with the momentum when Bai Yan swallowed the food just now, that was the impact of the food wrapped in his vital qi. There was no gap at all. Chapter 594. Lu Xiaoyu was facing two people. This outcome was neither good nor bad for him. His spiritual power was strong, and he was not at a disadvantage at all. Coupled with his experience in close combat, he could make up for his lack of magical power. The fierce battle unfolded in a small space. No one would be able to watch such a battle. It was like a fight between a few ruffians in the marketplace. Due to the viscous gastric juices and abundant vitality, the battle was completely out of the ordinary. Fists could not be swung. Palms could not be swung. There was only the poking of fingers, gouging of eyes, pulling of hair, choking of necks, biting of knees, tearing of clothes and pants. An hour later, the three exhausted people from both sides came to a tacit understanding and stopped fighting. No one could do anything to the other. The problem was that if this continued, everyone would perish together in this place. The 2-3 Pure One's cultivators were already at a disadvantage. They were exhausted from running for their lives. If not for their high cultivation and their ability to help each other whenever they were in danger, they would have been killed by Lu Xiaoyu long ago. They were very curious. Although the sword cultivator's mana was insufficient, his spiritual energy was different from that of ordinary people. This made it impossible for the two of them to work together. The two of them always failed at the last moment, as if he could see it. Lu Xiaoyu was also depressed. His assassination was always a little bit lacking. This little bit was also because of his cultivation level. Although his explosive power was very strong, the difference in the total amount of magical power was obvious. Ordinary people were not lacking in physical strength, but cultivators were not lacking in magical power. Moreover, the two of them could support each other, leaving very little time for him to kill. They both realized that before they found a way out, it was stupid to fight to the death. Gentle Breeze took the initiative to make peace. "Let's go out first, then we can fight." Lu Xiaoyu did not reply. "What about Qinchin?" His thoughts were very clear. Among the three sides, he was in the worst situation. His magical power was somewhat overdrawn, and he was close to the danger line. His body had also suffered serious injuries in the battle just now. Of course, the 2-3 Pure One's cultivators were more seriously injured. Most importantly, in terms of recovery ability, the swordsman would never be able to compete with a magical cultivator who was unique in terms of health. Therefore, it would be a problem if they got out. If it was still a dead end, then he might as well drag the two of them down with him. Gentle Breeze didn't hesitate. He was a decisive person. At this point, the hunt had already reached an uncontrollable stage. Out of the three of them, only he and Lianqing were lucky enough to bump into each other because they had fallen relatively close to each other. As for Dafa, there was no news of him at all. They had tried to search for him, but they were powerless to do so, so they quickly gave up on this unrealistic idea. The two of them could no longer suppress the swordsman. Even if they managed to escape, it was hard to say if they could continue fighting. The confrontation between cultivators was very particular about momentum, karma, timing, and other uncontrollable and mysterious reasons. This was also the difference between cultivators and mortals. They wouldn't beg endlessly. They were more accustomed to long-term preparations, and then when they sensed something, they would strike a fatal blow. This wasn't just a tradition of the swordsman. In fact, it was a habit of all cultivators. When the interest was lost or there was no clear trend, no one would be willing to continue. They had come because they thought they could win. Now that they had lost this confidence, and with the variable of Tao Wu, the situation was already out of control. There was no need to continue with the original plan. If Tao Wu doesn't give up, we'll attack it together. We'll talk about it later. Does fellow Taoist Yen agree? The three of them clapped their hands and made an oath. Just a moment ago, both sides were mortal enemies. Now, they had formed a temporary alliance. This was the other side of cultivation. On the other hand, learning to compromise was also very important. When the esophagus is opened, we can't get out. When Tao Wu swallows food, it will be accompanied by a pressure of vitality. We can't withstand it. Lianqing was the first to speak. Gentle Breeze pondered. Since we can't force our way in, is there any way to make it spit us out? Under certain circumstances, this thing will also vomit, right? Lu Xiaoyi pondered. This Tao Wu is producing. Everyone had a direction. They were all smart people, so they understood with a hint. There was no need to say more. One person's plan was short, but several people's plan was long, Gentle Breeze pondered. Actually, the best way is to pour wine. Sea beasts will faint. But we can't take things out of storage rings here. It's quite troublesome. Lianqing also said. Let's take a step back. Human blood is also very stimulating to beasts. This is especially true for sea beasts that are giving birth. They're most sensitive at this time. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. We can't take things out of storage rings. But what if the storage ring is destroyed? If the storage ring was destroyed, the items inside would also be partially destroyed. Thus, they couldn't use this method to take out spirit tools or swords. That was their last resort. But what if it was a storage ring that stored miscellaneous items? There was no cultivator who didn't have good wine on them. Moreover, almost all of them had storage rings that were specially designed for wine cellars. There was no problem with the wine bottles inside being destroyed. It would be better if the wine bottles were destroyed. The three of them decided on a direction. Lianqing Fine Wine had 2 storage rings filled with all kinds of fine wine. Gentle Breeze and Lu Xiaoyi each had 1. Would this amount of wine be enough to discuss buy in once? Most importantly, they only had a limited stock. This was their only chance. Gentle Breeze was very cautious. Let's use both methods. If that doesn't work, I'm afraid we'll have to destroy our storage rings. We'll use our tools to fight this thing to the death, but our chances aren't high. This is its home ground, and fellow Taoist Yen has found us a good coffin. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. This thing was lured out by your jade bottles, right? What does that have to do with me? Lianqing was indignant. Do you dare say that you didn't lure us here on purpose? Even if senior brother didn't throw the jade bottles, you would have used other methods to lure this thing out. Lu Xiaoyi didn't deny it. At this point, everything was clear. No one could fool anyone. Gentle Breeze stopped his junior brother from being dissatisfied. In this predicament, no one was innocent. Everyone had their own masters. It was only right and proper. Wine, let's use everything we have. Let's not hold back for the next opportunity. This is our only chance. We should use everything we have. What do you think, fellow Taoist? Okay. Lu Xiaoyi didn't have any objections. When the two sides weren't mortal enemies, Gentle Breeze had the bearing of a senior brother. The 3 pure ones had existed for hundreds of thousands of years and had their own foundations. In terms of talent, they weren't inferior to Xian Yuan in the slightest. They weren't any weaker than the 5th ring. Gentlemanly Breeze said word by word. Regarding human blood, I have some experience in this area. So, I will use my own blood essence. 3 drops. But I have a condition. I beg fellow Taoists to wait here for 1 more day. I wonder if fellow Taoists can agree? Bayan was disgusted by human blood. It wasn't ordinary blood, but the blood essence of a cultivator's heart. It was the essence of a cultivator's life. Everyone's cultivation realm was different. Those with a rich bloodline would have a dozen or so drops, and those who weren't skilled at this would have fewer. It was best to find a cultivator to do something like this. When a cultivator released their own blood essence, it would definitely affect their cultivation, especially when it was 3 drops. The reason why Gentle Breeze was doing this was to exchange for 1 more day. His goal was to wait for his junior brother Dafa. Just from this point alone, he was indeed a loyal and affectionate senior brother. Chapter 595. The 3 of them waited in silence, thinking about how things had developed to this stage. It wasn't regret. The higher a cultivator's realm, the less he would doubt his own goals. Even more so, he wouldn't feel sympathy in battle. A swordsman's heart was as hard as steel, and a Dharma cultivator wasn't that soft either. This was a battle of orthodoxies. Friendship in battle would only result in harm to both sides. The only way they could trace back was to find their own mistakes so that they could improve next time, and not doubt their own goals. Lu Xiaoyi knew that he had made a lot of mistakes. He didn't have to fall into such a passive situation. He knew that there were cultivators who wanted to encircle him and test their battle techniques. That wasn't wrong. What was wrong was the way he dealt with it. It wasn't pure. It lacked a kind of unruliness, and appeared to be worried about personal gains and losses. Unruliness was a kind of temperament. It was easy to say, but difficult to do. The difficult part was that a cultivator had to pull himself out of the intricate calculations and return to simplicity and naturalness. This wasn't brainlessness. He shouldn't have gone in circles to confuse his opponents in the Eastern Sea continent. This showed that he wasn't confident. In the end, he didn't manage to escape, and all of this was within his expectations. If a battle had happened on the continent, there wouldn't have been the dragon of the deep sea's breath, and he wouldn't have been swallowed into the stomach of a sea beast. He had been thinking about luring his opponents to the Imperial Oyster Reef Plate from the start. This was a mistake. It wasn't that he shouldn't have flown in this direction, but he shouldn't have used this as the basis for the entire chase. It was too deliberate. The Imperial Oyster Reef Plate could only be used as a backup plan, and not as the cornerstone of the battle. How should he fight? The simplest and most direct way was the best. He should have flown back at full speed from the start. If his opponents had the ability to catch up, then he would fight. If they couldn't, then he would just die. This was the true essence of sword manipulation. It wasn't deliberate, it wasn't pretentious. If he had done so, he could have forced the three pure ones to fight on the continent, and there wouldn't have been the dragon of the deep sea's breath. The core of the problem was that the three pure ones wanted to surround him. He didn't make full use of this. He acted as if he was desperately returning. Based on this point alone, he could have made the three pure ones lose sight of one thing, and then eliminate them in the midst of their movements. He could have used sword manipulation tactically, but not strategically. He was too petty and didn't let go. Being unruly, carefree, and following one's heart's desires were also a part of manipulating the sword. This was the standard of the Jing Dan cultivators. The storage rings they had now all had a space of 1 to 2 feet. It was equivalent to the space of a small room. If it was used as a wine cellar, the amount of wine stored in it would be considerable. Wine bottles, wine jugs, wine barrels, and so on were not as sturdy as spirit tools. They were all ordinary tools. How could they withstand such a strong impact from the spatial energy? In an instant, 4 room-sized bottles of wine were poured into Tao Wu's stomach. The strength of the effect was not something that could be described as excessive drinking. Gentle Breeze did not hesitate. With a tap of his finger, he forced out 3 drops of heart's blood. That was the essence of a cultivator's life, but to a demonic beast, it was the best medium to cause them discomfort. The blood and wine mixed together, emitting a strong aura. Even a Yuanying-level demonic beast like Tao Wu was greatly affected. It was extremely uncomfortable. The 3 of them could feel the walls of Tao Wu's stomach trembling violently, rippling layer by layer. Even they could feel Tao Wu's body spinning and turning, like a drunkard struggling to get out of control. However, Tao Wu did not vomit. Amidst this extreme discomfort, Tao Wu could still remember what was in its stomach. Those were 4 great tonics. If it opened its mouth and spat them out now, it would suffer a great loss. The 3 people in its stomach waited with hope. However, a moment later, Tao Wu's strong nerves controlled its desire to vomit. It swore to turn these 4 humans into nourishment for its children. The great motherly love made it shut its mouth tightly, like a poor loser who had accidentally drunk a cup of 1982 Lafite at a banquet. Vomiting was absolutely not an option. It was too wasteful. Gentle Breeze was a little disappointed. The power of the blood wine would not last for too long. Creatures with strong bodies like Tao Wu would quickly adapt to this feeling. They did not have much time left, but they could not even pour out a single bottle of blood wine. What else could they do? Lu Xiaoyi took the lead and placed his hand on the protruding part of Tao Wu's esophagus, massaging it with all his might. Stroke it! This kind of action came from the natural reaction of ordinary people when they were drunk. Of course, he could not use his finger to stab Tao Wu's throat. The only thing he could do was to press down on Tao Wu's esophagus. He did not understand the nervous system of demonic beasts, so he did not know if this would work. However, he had to do something, right? He couldn't just wait like this, right? Gentle Breeze and Tao Wu also guessed his intentions. Although it was unreliable, it was better than nothing. The three Jin Dan began to stroke Tao Wu's esophagus with all their might, hoping to save their little lives. Chapter 596. The effects of the alcohol and blood were slowly weakening, and hope was beginning to leave them. But the three of them still continued. Even the slightest trace of hope would not make them give up. This was the basic quality of a cultivator. Their perseverance had finally paid off. The Jin Dan had endured with great difficulty. This was not its complete state. The fact that it had given birth had a much more serious effect on its body than humans could imagine. Some of its instinctive reactions were not even something that its will could control. Due to the special period of its body, the nausea of human blood, the intoxication of strong alcohol, and the indistinct stimulation of the esophagus, its will could no longer resist the instincts of its body after holding on for a few moments. As its stomach rolled, the esophagus opened wide, and a turbulent, majestic mixture of rotten seafood, alcohol, and blood gushed out fiercely from the esophagus. Since it could not bear it, it would vomit to its heart's content. This time, the vomiting seemed to have triggered almost half of the food in its stomach. Through the relatively narrow esophagus, the speed of the vomiting was exceptionally fast. It was like the instant when an old-fashioned popcorn popped out. One could imagine what it would be like to have a large amount of junk moving at high speed through the narrow esophagus. It was also mixed with the unreconciled pressure of yuan qi, as well as the collision of various animal bones and other hard objects. In such a situation, the three Jin Dan cultivators were completely unable to control their bodies. Other than going with the flow, trying their best to summon their energy to defend themselves, and curling their bodies into a ball, they could not do anything else. This was worse than being trapped in a waterspout. The yuan qi mercilessly invaded their energy defenses, and countless collisions caused them to bleed profusely, making them dizzy and disoriented. Even though the time was very short, the three of them who did not suffer any serious injuries in the previous battle were unavoidably injured in this esophagus surfing. Their injuries were comprehensive. Their bones were broken, their internal organs were shattered, and their limbs were twisted. If the esophagus was as long as the intestines, they might not be able to survive. Thank the heavens, the esophagus was very short. In the next moment, they found themselves thousands of feet high in the sky. It was not because the Jin Dan had given birth in the sky, but because of this stinky liquid that had washed them up. As long as they did not die, it was worth it. In the sky, even they themselves despised the smell of their own bodies, as if they could never wash it clean. Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything else. The danger wasn't over yet. Their oath was that if the enemy continued to attack, they would fight together, but if, as now, there was no one to attend to them. He tried his best to maintain the balance of his body and slowly retreated in a calm manner. This process was filled with exhaustion and injuries. As if he was a fragile feather that could not withstand the wind, he no longer had any strength left. His remaining magical power reserves, other than maintaining the slowest flight, might only be enough for him to use his sword once. He didn't even know how much power he could use. The two spellcasters watched him leave. To be honest, they were not much stronger than the swordsman, but if the two of them worked together... Senior brother! The oath has been broken. What should we do? Gentle Breeze took a deep look at the figure that was getting further and further away and sighed. If he takes the initiative to provoke us, I will choose to face him head on. Because this meant that he was bluffing. If he takes the initiative to leave, I will judge that he is luring us. I won't walk right into his trap. Let's wait. We still have the problem of junior brother Dafa. He might have taken the back door. When he comes out, he might have angered the beast. When that happens, he will need our help. The two of them took out a flying spiritual tool and sat on it to repair their bodies and meridians. They swallowed pills and elixirs as if they didn't cost anything. They were very experienced in this aspect. A day later, a figure suddenly rose from the sea and pounced towards their flying boat. It was Taoist Dafa. Everyone had their own specialties, and the choice they made would be the most suitable for their situation. In the Bayan's devouring, the 4 people involved had all escaped with their lives. Among them, this person who had taken the back door alone didn't seem to have many injuries. When he reached the flying boat, Dafa was shocked. "Senior brother! How did this happen? Was it because of the fierce battle with the swordsman? Where is he?" Gentle Breeze didn't speak. First, it was a little embarrassing. Second, the stench from this guy could kill a cultivator. Lian Cheng replied. "It was like this when we came out from the main door. We almost lost our lives in there. It has nothing to do with the swordsman." Dafa laughed. "I told you. Senior brothers, you're just trying to save face. What's the difference between the front door and the back door? In essence, they belong to the different stages of food spoilage. Food is shit, and shit is food. Once you get over this, it doesn't matter anymore. I waited for you inside for a day. Otherwise, I would have come out long ago. It was the will of the heavens. If they had come out earlier, the swordsman would have died without a doubt. But compared to the swordsman's life and death, the friendship between senior and junior brothers was more important. Being able to wait for each other in such a difficult situation was the most precious thing. The swordsman has already left. He's within a day's journey, heading towards the north. His injuries are the same as ours, so he can only display a limited amount of strength. It's not even 30 to 40% of his usual strength. Search in the direction of the north. Pay special attention to the isolated islands and reefs along the way. In his current condition, he can't fly on his sword. It's very likely that he's looking for a place to recuperate. But remember, don't search for him for more than 3 days. After 3 days, the swordsman will partially recover. It'll be very dangerous for you to face him alone. This swordsman is no ordinary swordsman. He's cunning and ruthless. Don't underestimate him." Dafa nodded. "Understood. 3 days is the limit. I won't be rash and throw myself into a dangerous situation." Gentle Breeze nodded. "Your senior brother Lian Cheng and I will follow behind you. But in our current condition, we can't fly too fast. You'll have to rely on yourself for everything." Dafa nodded. Without hesitation, he flew forward. Lian Cheng was a little doubtful. "Senior brother, can you find him?" Gentle Breeze smiled bitterly. "With junior brother Dafa's temper, can you stop him? Rather than letting him sneak around and search without restraint, why not let him search ahead and set a time limit? That swordsman is extremely cunning. It's impossible that he doesn't have his guard up against us. If he sets up an ambush at a certain location, it'll be very difficult to take him down alone. It'll all depend on luck." Lian Cheng was very confident. The swordsman has always prided himself on cultivating diligently. He always flies on his sword and disdains using flying objects. How long can he last? Even if he has a flying object, the effect of recovering while flying on it is very limited. That's why I don't think he's gone far. It's very likely that he's hiding on one of the islands in the East Sea. It's just that we're in shallow waters and there are islands and reefs everywhere. It'll be very difficult to find him in detail." Gentle Breeze sighed again. "After we return, I'll write a letter to the faction asking for an order to restrict the actions of the Knowledge Update Temple in the north. Whether or not this swordsman returns, I'm afraid that he'll target the Knowledge Update Temple even more. From the looks of it, we don't know if our hunt this time was the right choice. Chapter 597. A large bird was flying above the eastern sea. The large-mouthed egret wasn't fast, but its existence was beyond the expectations of the three purities cultivators. They didn't need to worry about controlling it, and they could rest in peace. It had been a month since they left the Imperial Oyster Reef, but no one chased after them. He understood that they were powerless. In the past, he might have returned after his injuries had improved. What if he had gained something? He wasn't the type to admit defeat after suffering a loss. But now, he felt that there was no need. As long as he was in blue sky, they would meet again sooner or later. What was the point of fighting now? After gaining a deeper understanding of the sword manipulation art, his state of mind had changed. The so-called manipulation was to be unrestrained, not deliberate, not forced, and not stubborn. This was the essence of manipulation. Although he didn't kill any of his opponents in this battle, it had a profound effect on him. It would become a guiding principle for his future sword cultivation. Everything would be based on this. He went from wanting to be a rice worm to not wanting to be a rice worm, to not wanting to be a rice worm, to not caring about being a rice worm now. This process was the process of exploring the great Tao, the process of understanding manipulation. Now, he could truly say that he had learned how to manipulate the sword. He wasn't just learning the sword, but also learning how to be a person. He had completely thrown away his psychological burden, and began to live a swordsman's life that belonged to him alone. He would come and go freely, unrestrained. He would draw his sword when he felt like it, and withdraw when he felt like it. Why should he care about what others thought? Why should he care about the differences in Tao? Why should he let hatred affect his heart of the sword? He didn't hate. He didn't hate the three purities. He didn't hate Bayan either. If every battle could bring him this kind of enlightenment, he wouldn't care if he couldn't kill his opponents, and wouldn't care if he was covered in wounds. Everyone who paved the way for him was a noble person, and he was grateful for their kindness. This was a good trip. This battle was priceless. Several months later, Lu Xiaoyu returned to Mount Yi's Sword Chi Rushing Heaven Pavilion. He needed to explain to Reverend Nan why he didn't even bring back a single strand of hair from a mission that wasn't too difficult. "I know. But you came back a few months late. Is the scenery of the Eastern Sea so enchanting?" Nan Jinren had already received the news from Jinren. He was not surprised by their choice. It was good to have a choice, no matter which one it was. Lu Xiaoyu smiled and said, "Donghai people are very hospitable. So, I decided to get closer to them." Spiritual Master Nan did not ask further. It was Jean Dan and had the right to decide. He was not a nanny. "Let's just say that you've completed this mission. Do you agree?" Lu Xiaoyu let out a sigh of relief. "I thought the sect would be dissatisfied because we didn't bring anyone along." Spiritual Master Nan snorted. "Is the sect that petty? My Xianyuan sword faction will not change just because of a group of people, even if they are talented in the Tao of alchemy. We rely on swords, not pills." After a pause, he explained a little. "Jinren is very resistant to the pressure of bearing Xuanyuan's outer sect. This is normal because human hearts are free and unrestrained. The current Jinren is no longer the Jinren from 10,000 years ago. Xianyuan is also not the Xianyuan from 10,000 years ago. This relationship is a burden for both sides. Isn't Xianyuan also like this? Should we protect the Jinren in the Eastern Sea? Or should we just let them be? We are also in a difficult position. In the end, the closest connection in the cultivation world is the Tao of orthodoxy, not bloodline. Some burdens should be unloaded. The debt of our ancestors, in fact, may not be shouldered by us descendants, but we have to because of some illusory things. This result is very good. As far as I am concerned, you didn't bring anyone back, at least it will save a lot of trouble." Lu Xi. "It's good that you don't blame me for acting on my own." Disciple really saw that most of the Jinren didn't have the intention to return to the north. "I was also afraid that such a group of people would bring more trouble than benefits. Why bother?" After a few words of gossip, Lu Xiaoyu left. Before he left the hall, Spiritual Master Nan's teasing came from behind. Although I see that you are in good spirits, your complexion seems to be lacking blood qi. Is it because you can't adapt to the food of the Eastern Sea? Why don't I treat you to a seafood dinner tonight as a reward for your hard work? Lu Xiaoyi laughed dryly. Disciple is not good at seafood, forget it. What happened in the Eastern Sea was exposed. After all, it was a shallow sea and there were always cultivators passing by. It was not strange that it spread. He didn't report it to the sect because he wanted to deal with it himself. Spiritual Master Nan's teasing was not to help him. He himself was a fighter of Mount E. Besides Spiritual Master Nan, who else could help him? This was the responsibility of a swordsman. He was no longer a small cultivator of foundation establishment. This trip to the Eastern Sea, back and forth for a year, he had gained a lot. He needed to digest it well, and then make some minor adjustments in his swordsmanship system. This kind of adjustment would accompany him throughout the cultivation process until death. Life had returned to its original rhythm and trajectory. On the surface it seemed so, but Lu Xiaoyi knew that it was already different. In the past, it was repetitive mechanically, but now it was more casual. In the past, he went to the Old Man Peak with a purpose. Although it was hidden very well, it was still there. He couldn't hide it from the group of yawning old monsters. But now he was different. Old Man Huang saw this very clearly. Only after returning from the Eastern Sea did the old guys start to really accept him. He was like a green bean sprout in a cluster of yellow bean sprouts. Lu Xiaoyi began to carefully sort out his swordsmanship system. It wasn't appropriate to describe it as removing the wheat from the chaff. To be precise, it was a problem of how to use the fighting style of these swordsmanship. His previous fighting style was still slightly old-fashioned. Every move lacked spirituality. It lacked a flash of inspiration in battle. It lacked the unrestrained freedom of a heavenly steed soaring across the sky. This kind of incoherence would make him pause temporarily in battle and put his focus on deep calculations. It wasn't that he shouldn't calculate, but it was natural. In fact, many times, as long as his attacks were smooth and harmonious enough, he didn't need to wait for the opponent to reveal a flaw. He could completely force the opponent to take the initiative to reveal his weakness while running for his life. Rhythm, changes, naturalness, carefreeness, indifference, and a flash of inspiration could form the true sword style. It was not just a formality of jumping here and there. He had talent in swordsmanship, but this kind of talent couldn't let him do everything. There were many things that talent couldn't solve, such as philosophy and character. His current swordsmanship was more like a kind of mountain and river splashing ink without any purpose. He didn't stick to a fixed pattern anymore. Instead, he splashed as he pleased. He let the heart drive the sword drive the man, and the man let go of the heart. He knew that he might have crossed a certain realm of swordsmanship. Chapter 598. Lu Xiaoyi chose a few more swordsmanship for himself. He chose them from Wen Guangfeng's Fanlu because he felt that the swordsmanship of the external sword was not very imaginative. It only focused on the engraving of the sword formation of the flying sword. As a result, the fighting style of the external sword was not very flexible. Once the flying sword was out, the opponent would probably know what you were good at, which was the worst thing in a battle. Good swordsmanship should be unexpected. It should not be deliberately cloudy, but naturally unconstrained. In this regard, he coveted many of the swordsmanship of the internal sword. He had a sword spirit, so he could imitate many swordsmanship. The key to learning swordsmanship was to learn the spirit of the sword. As for how to show it, it was not important. Thinking, the key was to be able to do it casually. That was what he valued the most. As for the main style of the swordsmanship, he did not intend to change it. The core of the external sword would never change. In this aspect, he could only strengthen it. There was no other way. The only thing to change was that the sword could be heavy, but the person could not be heavy. Remodeling the swordsmanship system was a long process. Once a person's habit was formed, it was hard to change it. He would always follow the old habits subconsciously. Even if he knew it was not perfect, he had to overcome it slowly. He still had time. It had been more than 2 years since he came to Green Sky. At this time, he could be said to have really settled down. He made some friends, got familiar with Shao Mountain, and understood part of Green Sky. The key was that he had a relative understanding with Nanjiren, who was in charge, so he was not always on standby. When he really settled down, it was time to solve some personal problems. Not his personal problems, but senior sister Yan Cheng's personal problems. Little Snow City was a small city more than 300 miles away from Shao Mountain. It was quiet and peaceful, standing aloof from worldly affairs. Within the snowy region of Mount Shao, there were not many mortal cities. The bitter cold made life inconvenient, so many young people did not want to continue living here. Those who could cultivate went to Xianyuan City. Those who could not cultivate went to the south. There were more colorful mortal worlds there, but it was far more satisfying for the young people than a closed environment like Snow City. Without external disputes, such a city had the conditions for population growth. Additionally, the outflow of population balanced the expansion of the city. It was a common phenomenon among the few cities around Mount Pyrolite. The Fong Clan's school was located in a small corner of the city. It was not big, but the small courtyard was well organized, clean and tidy. In the courtyard, the scattered sounds of children reading could be heard. If he just wanted to go out and see the world, he could still understand. He was also like this when he was young. However, the problem was not so simple. A few months ago, a caravan came to Snow City. It was a caravan of grassland people from the west. They sold things like fur and herbs. Although it was not common, there were always 1 or 2 caravans in a year, so it was not rare. What made him angry was that this time, there was a coquettish grassland girl in the caravan. He did not know why, but after a while, she fell in love with his son. He was his only son, and he was used to being arrogant. He did not want to get married early, so he turned a blind eye to it. He thought that when he was a few years older, he would naturally stop playing around. Then, with the Fong clan's small reputation in Snow City, it would not be difficult for him to marry a lady from a noble family. However, he did not expect that the grassland girl would take his place. Maybe it was because of the incomparable attraction of the exotic scenery, or maybe it was because of the pretentious style of the young ladies in the small town, which made his son feel disgusted. When he found out, his son was already inseparable from the girl, which made him very helpless. This was not a big deal. At worst, he could just marry her. Although the land was grassland, the seeds were still the Fong clan's. Even if he planted the snow lotus, he would not be able to become hula grass. However, the next blow was too much for him. His son actually proposed to live in the grassland with the girl for a few years, and at the same time, to develop the Fong clan's education plan in the grassland. This was unacceptable. How many years was a few years? What if they gave birth there and did not come back? Would the family be separated like this? It was impossible for them to go to that place at such an old age. The worst thing was that after the manager of Snow City heard about this, he strongly supported it. He said that supporting grassland education was the responsibility of every Central Plains person, and that it was the best way to communicate between the two clans, and so on. If you are so kind, why don't you go? However, the arm could not twist the leg. His son was enchanted by the grassland fairy, and with the support of the manager of the city, it was a foregone conclusion that he would go. This was what he was worried about. Chapter 599. The next day, his son brought his wife home to say goodbye. The old man didn't want to open the door at first, as they had been in a cold war for months. He was unwilling to let it go, but he still opened the door under his wife's cries. This was the last time they could see each other. He didn't know when they would meet again. There were 3 people standing at the door. Xiao Fang and his wife were kneeling on the ground to say goodbye to their mother. A few steps away, A young man was standing quietly with sword-like eyebrows. Judging from his attire and bearing, he didn't look like a person from the grassland. Old man Fang refused to back down, and still didn't speak to his son. He stared at the young man behind him and walked up to him, scrutinizing him. "Who are you? Why did you come with them?" The young man smiled, revealing a row of white teeth. "I was ordered by Lord Lu to send Fang Zihui to the grassland and arrange for the opening of the school." Lord Lu was the manager of Little Snow's city and a cultivator. Little Snow's city was close to Xianyuan, so there was no government system. Usually, it was managed by the manager of the school in the city, who was an old foundation establishment cultivator from Xianyuan. Little Snow's city didn't have many things to do, so it was easy to hire some local elders and disciples from big families to manage it. The Taoist Hall was where Xianyuan collected and trained Taoist children. It was a sworn enemy of Old Fang's school. However, Xianyuan was too powerful, and Old Fang didn't dare to show his resentment. He could only struggle under the suppression of the Taoist Hall. Therefore, his attitude wasn't very good. "My son went to the grassland because of your school, didn't you? Now you're trying to be a good person? Hypocrite!" The young man's attitude was very good, and his smile didn't change. "I'll let you know. I'm not a member of the school, but I was asked by Lord Lu to take care of him along the way. The Fang family of Little Snow's city has been dedicated to education for generations, and Lord Lu admires them very much. He ordered me to take good care of Fang Zihui's basic necessities, as a role model for the two families to live in harmony." Old Master Fang harumphed loudly and did not think much of it. The ancestral teachings of the Fang family disapproved of the children of the family learning Tao. They believed that it was not proper work. There were also some reasons for this. They were all old matters, but the traditions left behind would not change. The young man said gently, "In order to commend the Fang family's good deeds, Master Lu said that in the future, the children in the dojo who are not suitable to learn Tao will be sent to the school in the city to continue with their basic education. The order will be issued in the next few days. At that time, the teachers of the school in the city will be invited to discuss the specific matters." Old Mr. Fang is a person of virtue and prestige, and Master Lu has especially mentioned that he hopes you can give him some pointers. Seeing that old man Fang was still skeptical, the young man sighed. The affairs of mortals were just as troublesome. The Fang clan was, of course, senior apprentice sister Fang Ru's family. When Fang Ru went to the fifth ring, the Fang clan was still living in Xianyuan City. Who would have thought that they'd moved here and never mentioned that there was a female cultivator in the clan? Perhaps they felt ashamed of it? More than 200 years had passed, and senior apprentice sister had long become the ancestral grandmother of the family. However, Lu Xiaoyi doubted that her name could still be recorded in the family tree. The thoughts of mortals were very complicated, and the difference in their beliefs was not something he could persuade them to change. Old man Fang was stubborn, but he couldn't just ignore him. Thus, he explained to Little Snow City's dojo manager, Master Lu, that the Fang family was one of Xuanyuan's own people. With a great ancestor who had formed his gold core at the fifth ring, his future was limitless. He instructed Master Lu to secretly take care of the Fang family. This was how the Dao Dojo's children were separated. To Master Lu, Jin Dan was his martial uncle. This kind of care was necessary. Regardless of how much this old man resented cultivators, it was another matter. Looking after the Gu family was something Lu Xiaoyi had to do. If they were in Xianyuan City, everything would have been very simple. However, the Fang family had a strong scholarly temperament. They were noble and self-restrained, and disdained to enjoy the treatment of cultivators' families in Xianyuan City. 100 years ago, they moved out of Xianyuan City and settled down in Little Snow's City. Thus, their background as a cultivator's family was cut off, and no one in Little Snow's City knew about it. Before he left, senior apprentice sister had instructed him to come back and take a look. She was aware of her family's bad temper, so she warned him not to force the Fang family's children to enter the Dao. It would be good if they could live in a peaceful environment. There was no problem with old man Fang. A peaceful city at the foot of a snowy mountain. It was Xuanyuan's territory. Even if the sky fell, it wouldn't fall here. As long as he said hello to Little Snow City's dojo, he would be able to live out his remaining years in peace. The problem was Little Fong, the only descendant of the Fong family. How could Lu Shi know what kind of place the grassland was? He could only get a general idea from Master Lu, and then rush over. This kind of care was very troublesome. People were not kittens or puppies. They had their own thoughts, especially Little Fong. He had the urge to travel the world, and the nourishment of love. He reckoned that even if his father jumped into a well, he wouldn't be able to stop him, let alone an outsider like him. How could he persuade him? He didn't want to persuade him. The best way was to follow him and see if this woman was sincere. He wanted to see if the grassland was suitable for Little Fong. If there was something fishy, then he would think of a way to stop Little Fong's thoughts. If everything went according to nature, then he could only let him be. He wouldn't force Little Fong to stay. That would be a lazy way of doing things. Man was the spirit of all living things, and he had his own thoughts. If he was sent to the grassland for a few years to fulfill his dreams, and then he would be educated by reality. Maybe there would be a time when he would change his mind. If he forced him to stay in Little Snow City, then he didn't know what would happen. After all, cultivators were different from mortals, and he couldn't always keep an eye on this place. So he asked Master Lu for this job. The grassland was a traditional power in the northern region. They didn't have a good relationship with Xianyuan, and they were limited by their own strength. So they had always been in an endless cycle of accumulating strength, showing off, being suppressed, being cut off, hibernating, and then trying to make a comeback. The grassland power had a very strong characteristic, and that was their strong vitality. Even if the spiritual opportunity withered 10,000 years ago, it didn't do anything to them. When the spiritual opportunity was restored, they immediately became lively again. But in the past few hundred years, the situation had changed. The grassland people seemed to have been enlightened. They began to be easy to communicate with, and were willing to accept the ideas and culture of the outside world. One of them was to allow scholars from the Central Plains to come to the grassland and spread their culture. This was a huge change. In time, when the grassland people gradually accepted the culture of the Central Plains, there would be no existence in the northern region that could threaten Xianyuan. So the Xianyuan Sword School supported this. In other words, Xiao Fang's marriage and going to the grassland to teach was in line with the general trend, and should be promoted. Of course, no matter how much they promoted it, they wouldn't send a Jin Dan to follow him. At most, they would send some money, spread the news, and give some benefits to the family. Education was a long process, and it couldn't be done in one step. It could easily take hundreds of years. How could they go to war for a scholar? Lu Xiaoyi went purely for personal reasons, and he used the excuse of official business. He was just a foundation establishment so-called Master Lu, so how could he refuse in front of his martial uncle? So this arrangement was made, and it could only be seen as a kind of concern from the government. After all, in Little Snow City, Fang Zihui was the first scholar to respond to the government's call. Since he couldn't eat seafood, going to the grassland to taste roasted whole lamb was also good, Lu Xiaoyi thought. Chapter 600. Lu Xiaoyi followed the grassland people's caravan. However, there were two more people in the caravan on the way back. One was a scholar, and the other was an official-looking man. The grassland people's caravan had no shortage of fine horses. The horses in the cultivation world were different from those in the mortal world. It was not a dream for them to travel thousands of miles in a day. The grassland in the northern region was actually not far from the Shao Mountain. The distance of 6,000 to 7,000 miles to the west was nothing for cultivators. Even for mortals, it would take them less than 10 days to complete the journey if they ran at full speed. Fang Zihui spent most of his time with his wife. Grassland people were more straightforward and open-minded, so he was not surprised at all. However, he did not like the official-looking man Lu Xiaoyi. On this point, Fang Zihui had inherited the Fang family's tradition of having a bad view of cultivation. In his opinion, since Fang Zihui was sent by the Taoist club, he must be related to cultivation in countless ways. Fang Zihui's guess was not wrong. On the contrary, the grassland people were more enthusiastic about him. As businessmen who had been away from home for a long time, they certainly understood the importance of communicating with officials. Every day, they drank good wine and made merry. When the caravan came, they were loaded with furs and herbs. When they returned, they were carrying all kinds of ironware and tea leaves. Of course, their speed was not fast. Fortunately, there were few accidents on this route. In the vicinity of the snowy mountains and grassland, no robbers dared to act openly. A month later, the caravan entered the grassland and returned to their homes. Their food began to become more abundant. The yurts of the herdsmen were their supply points. Lu Xiaoyi finally ate an authentic roasted whole lamb. To be honest, it tasted very good. It was much better than cooking by himself. After the caravan entered the grassland, the team of dozens of people began to disperse gradually. In groups of 3 or 5, they ran back to their own tribes. The grassland was a hole to the outside, but there were countless large and small tribes inside. However, they did not gather together like human cities. This was decided by the grassland environment. The herdsmen would always go to the place with abundant water and grass. Qing Duo was Xiao Fang's wife from the grassland. She came from the large tribe of Raiding Tribe and was a famous flower on the grassland. However, she married an outsider. Actually, many young men from the grassland regarded her with hostility. The closer they were to the Raiding Tribe, the more obvious they felt it. But the 3 of them didn't take it seriously. Qing Duo had a big heart, and was already used to the men from the grassland fighting and killing for her. Xiao Fang was full of wisdom. Although he wasn't good at fighting, but in terms of knowledge, who could be better than him? Lu Xiaoyi really didn't care. Of course, the school would also be opened in the Stab tribe. For most of the year, they would probably have to chase after water plants and move. Only when winter came would they settle down in the camp and endure the long winter. Therefore, it was actually a seasonal school. There were only 4 or 5 months in a year where there were conditions for learning. Children couldn't be gathered during the herding. Fang Zihui was the same. Most of the time, he had to herd the sheep and horses with Qing Duo's family and experience the wind and rain of the grassland. When winter came, when other people started to sing and dance and enjoy the happiness of the grassland people, he would start his own education. Ideals and love should not come into contact with reality. In most cases, they would be broken into pieces by cruelty. But these things couldn't be taught. They could only feel it by themselves. It was normal if they couldn't bear it. If they could bear it, they would grow up. If it was difficult, Fang Zihui would have to bear it. Lu Xiaoyi wouldn't provide any help to him. Because for him, the best result was that this guy couldn't bear it and sent him back to his parents in Snow City. That would save him a lot of trouble. Finally, it was Qing Duo's and the other 2's turn to leave the group. The group now was less than half of the original group. These merchants would often stay in the camp and wouldn't herd the grassland. But Qing Duo wasn't a merchant. She was just a young woman who followed a family elder to the Central Plains for fun. She was also the best merchant. Now, it was time for her to go and find her family's herds. She was as happy as a child. Beside her, Fang Zihui was also foolishly happy. It was just that his smile was twitching a little. That was the heart-wrenching pain of his inner thighs after riding for a long time. Every time the horse moved up and down, the pain would follow. But he still persisted, clenching his teeth and enduring it. Sometimes, although the persistence of a scholar was a little unreasonable, it was also terrifyingly tenacious. It had nothing to do with whether the body was strong or not. It was a test of one's will. In the future there would be a lot of tests like this. A few days later, the 3 of them caught up with Qing Duo's family's herds. Qing Duo ran towards her family members whom she hadn't seen for a long time. At this time, Fan Zihui was very embarrassed, glaring at Lu Xiaoyi. How long are you going to follow us? We have already reached home. Do you think an ordinary herdsman's family can support two men who don't care about herding? You have done your duty, you can go back now. Don't you think what you are doing is making everyone embarrassed? Lu Xiaoyi shrugged and said some nonsense that was completely irrelevant. Did you see that? Their family only has one yurt. It's impossible for them to set up another yurt for you during the journey. Don't you think it's awkward for such a big family to squeeze into one yurt? Sheep's breath, farting, smelly feet, cow dung, snoring. You have your own bedroom since you were young, right? Fan Zihui was trembling with anger, but that hateful guy was still going on. What do you do at night when the passion is strong? Endure it or? To be honest, your voices are a little loud. After dodging the whip that the angry Fan Zihui threw at him, Lu Xiaoyi turned his horse around. Even if you beg me to stay in this yurt, I won't be willing to. Unless there are 8 or 10 grassland widows in it. My task is to record your experience in the grassland, as a guide for the future generations. So I'm sorry to disappoint you. I'm afraid I will stay here for a while. Just pretend that I don't exist. You don't have to care about my basic necessities. He rode out and his voice came from afar. By the way, I have already bought this horse from your wife, so it doesn't count as occupying your family's property. Providing protection to a mortal was a very simple and troublesome task. If it was within the territory of his own cultivation force, it would be a very simple task and he would just need to hand it over to the local cultivators. But in the grassland, it was obviously not feasible. Of course, he couldn't protect them for a lifetime. In Lu Xiaoyi's view, 1 year was enough for Fan Zihui to really adapt to life in the grassland. After all, there was no war here. He hoped that when he saw his senior sister, he could play it down and say that the Fan family's bloodline was flourishing and the inheritance was endless. 1 year was nothing to Jean Dan, and it was a good chance for him to relax here. The grassland stretched as far as the eye could see, with herds of cows and sheep. The wind blew the grass low, and it was blue as if it had been washed. It was completely different from the beautiful scenery of the snow mountain. He had already adapted to the beauty of the snow mountain, but this didn't mean that he couldn't appreciate other beauties. As long as it was nature, it was beautiful. Chapter 601. Fan Zihui began his new life as a herdsman. He changed from a pampered, scholarly young master to a man who rode on a horse and threw a lasso. It was hard to describe his decision. Perhaps everyone would try to be another version of themselves when they were young. Or maybe it was the reverse psychology of 20 years of hard study. Lu Xiaoyi found it strange. If he had such perseverance, why didn't he try to cultivate? It was incredible that he could be changed so thoroughly by love. But to Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, this young master actually persevered. It was early summer when they entered the grassland, and now it was late autumn. Although Fan Zihui was not a good herdsman, he followed the rules and did not drag the others down. This was a visible improvement. In a few years he could become a real grassland man. How much knowledge did he still remember? In the nearby pasture, the herdsmen often saw a stranger riding a horse. They did not know which family he belonged to, which tribe he was from, or how he lived. They had never seen his camp or his food. He was like a ghost, wandering in the pasture. He came and went like a ghost. Some herdsmen reported his abnormality to the head of the tribe. The head sent a dozen riders to interrogate him, but after seeing the document from Snow City, they could do nothing. The tribes and the people of the Central Plains had a general trend of reconciliation. Every Central Plains person who came to the grassland would be treated kindly, especially this kind of Central Plains official who was responsible for observing the teaching. The head of the caravan did not hide his identity, and people in the tribe had also heard of him. So, the matter was left unsettled. In the past few months, in his eyes, Fan Zihui had been through countless situations. Not only did he have to deal with the daily work of the herdsman, but he also had to deal with the harassment of some grassland wanderers with bad intentions. But the couple had withstood it. When their relationship was impeccable, their willpower was indestructible. Lu Xiaoyi, who was watching from afar, sighed. This was not the script he wanted. What he wanted most was for them to be defeated by reality, and then he could bring them back to report on his mission. But now, he decided to wait and see for another winter. If the school was properly organized and everything went smoothly, and Fang Zihui truly gained a firm foothold on the grassland, then there was no need for him to waste any more time here. In fact, most of the ordinary pasture herdsmen were forthright and straightforward. In a sense, they were not as good at playing tricks as the Central Plains people. With Xiao Feng's intelligence, as long as he won the respect of the people at the border, and as long as the couple remained unswerving, staying here would not be much more dangerous than staying in Snow City. These herdsmen had not yet come into contact with the inheritance of cultivation on the grassland. Well, it was not called cultivation here, but the witchcraft. It was somewhat similar to the foundation of body cultivation, but with more mysterious things like secret incantations and worshipping gods. Lu Xiaoyi did not care much about these. He was here to protect people, not to fight with the grassland witchcraft. In the snowy mountains, he could learn from the grandeur of the snowy mountains, and in the grassland, he could experience the vastness of the grassland. The mirror was born from the heart, and enlightenment came from the scenery. With a heart that was close to nature, he could always find something that belonged to him from the surrounding environment. He was very satisfied, because the grassland allowed him to open up his mind. This had nothing to do with what kind of orthodoxy was entrenched here. Cultivators should not be so superficial. This was far faster than when he was in seclusion. A secluded environment would often lead to a stagnant thought process. However, by allowing himself to wander in different natural sceneries, he was able to let his mind fly freely, and it was also his unrestrained swordsmanship. Soon, it was the end of autumn, and the grass had turned yellow. To the herdsman, it was time to return to the settlement. Qing Duo and her family were also returning. They would spend this harsh winter in the warm yurts of the settlement. This time, Fang Zihui and his wife would also have their own tent. Fang Zihui was a little impatient, because it was finally time for him to show what he was good at. Although he did not look like a scholar from the Central Plains at all, with his current skin and attire, he looked remarkably like a man from the grassland. The process was easier than Lu Xiaoyi had imagined. The people from the Central Plains had extended an olive branch, and the people from the grassland had also raised an excellent wine. This was originally a process of integration that was tacitly approved by the higher-ups of both sides. Of course, it was not difficult for them, and instead, it was supported by many sides. Fang Zihui even obtained the right to use a large yurt for the children to study in. Of course, not all of them were children. There were also many young people who were full of curiosity about the outside world. There were both men and women, and it was very lively. Teacher Xiao Feng became the main character, and Lu Xiaoyi became bored. This was because everything was going too smoothly, so smoothly that he was flustered. Winter was the most lively period for the people of the grassland, because everyone gathered together. Furthermore, the people of the grassland were a people who were good at singing and dancing, and there were endless bonfire parties. It was a place that could cure loneliness the most. Lu Xiaoyi had to admit that even he had fallen in love with this place. It was a simple and happy place. Life was just so peaceful. Lu Xiaoyi watched everything that happened to Xiao Feng in this new environment. He never interfered, waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to get tired, and finally waiting for him to give up. There was always an end to winter. When early spring arrived, the herdsmen began to prepare for their annual herding. They had been stuffing themselves with food for the entire winter, but because of the lack of exercise, they had all become fatter. After half a year of hard herding, they would slim down again. But before that, there was still the spring sacrifice that the grassland people valued the most. This was the most important festival in the grassland. It had been like this since the beginning of the grassland people. They would pray to the heavens and thank the heavens for bestowing them with fertile pastures and sweet water. This was also a great ceremony that every herdsman had to attend. If they did not attend and went out to herd, it was said that they would be punished by the god of the grassland, so no one dared to ignore it. Lu Xiaoyi was also among the herdsmen, heading towards the location of the spring sacrificial ceremony. This was not the spring sacrificial ceremony of the Stab tribe, but the spring sacrificial ceremony of all the people of the dozens of nearby tribes. It was vast and boundless. In Lu Xiaoyi's plan, when the spring sacrifice ended and Fang Zihui and his family set out for the pasture, it would be the day he left. Because the relationship between the young couple was like glue, there was no unbearable ending that he had imagined at all. The spring sacrifice, he would just take it as a farewell ceremony for him. The herdsmen gathered from all directions at a place called the Black Deer Plain. This was the sacred place of several grassland tribes in the vicinity. Because the legendary god of the grassland was the true form of a black deer, all important gatherings in the tribes would be held here. There were many gods in the grassland, such as the black deer god, the black horn god, the titan god, the eagle god, and so on. They were all totems of the tribes. The crowd grew bigger and bigger, from 100,000 to 100,000, but they were all in good order. They were not crowded and messy, but seemed to be very organized. This was not discipline, but a kind of restraint of faith. Chapter 602. The Prairie People's Spring Sacrifice was not a one-day event. Hundreds of thousands of people gathered together, and it was difficult to complete a certain ceremony on a certain day. They needed other events to gather people and wait for those who were late to arrive. Wrestling, horse racing, goat snatching, archery, wrestling, stone throwing, all kinds of grassland-style competitions were held one after another. These were the entertainment methods of ordinary human beings, and Lu Xiaoyi didn't find any grassland magaspreists among them. He was just there to watch the fun. He would not participate in it himself. How bored would he be to compete with ordinary people? It was very lively, very harmonious, and everyone was jubilant. The only thing that made Lu Xiaoyi complain was that in such a large ranch, when hundreds of thousands of people were gathered together, the household waste produced. No one would take care of it. It could be imagined that this would be the best fertilizer for the growth of the grass. At night bonfires rose, and there were countless small yurts, forming a beautiful and spectacular scene. It would be very beautiful and shocking if one were to see it from the sky. However, the yurts were prepared for the elderly, children, and women. The men would drink by the bonfires until midnight, and then fall asleep in the embers. Their physical fitness was not comparable to that of ordinary people in the Central Plains, even the Snow Mountain people who were used to the bitter cold. Such a large-scale sacrificial event would usually be held in spring because the grass had just sprouted. If it were in summer or autumn, the knee-high weeds would be burned into black soil by the wildfires. Such an event lasted for more than 10 days before the real sacrificial ceremony arrived. In Lu Xiaoyi's eyes, it was a group of wizards and sorcerers. The Prairie people's cultivation system was different from that of the Central Plains people. They did not emphasize foundation establishment, Jin Dan, Yuanying, but the corresponding wizards, sorcerers, and ancestors. With Lu Xiaoyi's current Jin Dan cultivation, he would be a sorcerer in the prairie. It was also a special group with a very high status. At least, the prairie girls could choose at will. What shocked Lu Xiaoyi was that among the dozens of wizards and sorcerers present, half of them had clusters of providence. He could not understand this. Since when could clusters of providence be sold wholesale? In the 200 years in the Fifth Ring, the number of people with providence he had met, including plants and animals, was less than 10. After coming to Clear Sky Continent for so many years, he didn't even see a single one. He could understand. All the outstanding cultivators were sent to the Fifth Ring, and Blue Sky couldn't retain many people with good fortune. But what was going on with this grassland? Was the world going to change? Among the 17 shamans, there were 14 shamans and 3 senior shamans. Among them, 6 of the shamans possessed a cluster of providence, and all 3 of the senior shamans possessed a cluster of providence. This was completely illogical. Could this be the reason why the grasslands suddenly opened up? Were they blessed by the heavenly Tao? Everyone had their own destiny. Being born in this world was a kind of destiny. However, this kind of luck was not formed and existed secretly. In Lu Xiaoyu's understanding, only the fragments of the great Tao of destiny that had collapsed had the function of accumulating luck in the sea of consciousness. There were definitely more than 17 prairie magi, and they couldn't have only sent prairie magi with providence groups to attend a festival of mortals. In other words, there were a lot of people with providence among the prairie magi, and their numbers might have reached a terrifying level. This was simply unimaginable. Why would the shards of fate be concentrated in one area? A race? Did they know about each other's clusters of providence? Or could it be that the clusters of providence could be duplicated? The only difference was that the clusters of providence of these prairie magi were somewhat lifeless, as if they had never been activated. Countless questions rushed into his mind, and he warned himself that he must be careful. Any irresponsible deduction would affect the direction of the northern region, and even the direction of Qing Kong. Either Xian Yuan was unlucky, or the prairie magi was exterminated. However, he couldn't discuss this problem with his sect. Facing this alone put a lot of pressure on him. His realm was still not enough to deal with this kind of situation. The only thing he could do was to observe silently, and then hide his cluster of providence as much as possible. In fact, among the cultivators present, in terms of the size and vitality of the clusters of providence, he, Lu Xiaoyi, was the most abnormal. Not only were they robust, but they were also colorful. In normal activities, he usually only used one sword spirit to hide his providence. Later on, after fusing with the colors of nature, he realized that others might not be able to see through his providence anymore. There was a high chance that they would treat the colorful thing as some other strange mystery. But now, for the sake of caution, he placed 3 sword spirits in his sea of consciousness, and covered his colorful providence completely. If he were to have a conflict with the witch magi here, it would be hard to explain. Moreover, what if this situation was a blessing for the northern region, a blessing for the common people? They didn't do anything outrageous. You can't judge them as guilty just because they also have your secrets. This wasn't the style of a swordsman, and it wasn't Lu Xiaoyi's philosophy. He wished that everyone in the world would have great providence. Of course, this kind of thinking was pure nonsense. He couldn't understand the witch magi's ritual, so he just let them be. These were all tricks to deceive mortals, and it wasn't surprising. He just focused on the providence of these people. After observing for a long time, he made some new discoveries. For example, they were all lifeless. They were even more lifeless than before he fused with nature and entered the peacock plume. He could understand why the Foundation establishment providence was lifeless, but it didn't make sense for the 3 sorcerers to be lifeless. This kind of providence seemed to have not been activated. What practical significance did it have for the cultivation of practitioners? Or was there a fundamental difference between the witchcraft of the grassland and the cultivation of Taoism? Just based on the application of the providence, they were far inferior to Blue Beard on Whirling Planet. They were even inferior to the Begonia Flower Master and the Dove Lion he met in the splendid 5 Rings. The dazzling ritual soon came to the end, and it was also the most important part, the sacrifice to heaven. There were a total of 8 sorcerers standing on the high platform, and all of them didn't have providence. Was this a coincidence? Or was it inevitable? It must be inevitable. There couldn't be such a coincidental distribution. Then, it could be guessed that something would happen during the sacrifice to heaven from the lower realm. For example, would heaven give these 8 sorcerers more providence? The situation developed according to Lu Xiaoyi's speculation. Although the process was different, the purpose was very clear. In some kind of mysterious sacrifice to heaven, Lu Xiaoyi suddenly found that the providence of the 9 sorcerers and sorcerers with providence began to disperse, as if it was about to leave their bodies. This kind of providence was very directional when it left the body. Lu Xiaoyi was very suspicious of their purpose. Were they passing it to the other 8 sorcerers? It seemed that the direction was wrong. The 9 providence that left the body was in a certain direction in the void, but it had nothing to do with the 8 sorcerers on the high platform. What Lu Xiaoyi didn't understand was that the providence that was being dispersed didn't disappear. Instead, it condensed into smoke and shot out rapidly, falling into an inexplicable mystery. How did they do it? Looking at the hundreds of thousands of devout grassland believers around him, Lu Xiaoyi immediately understood. Where did the providence go? The reason why they could do it was because they used the faith of hundreds of thousands of grassland people as the carrier. Everything was planned. It was not a sacrifice to heaven at all. Chapter 603. Lu Xiaoyi knew that he was actually capable of intercepting this providence. His current providences were no longer inanimate objects. After several upgrades, he no longer needed to kill the other party to intercept their providences. However, in order to do this, the opponent could not be too powerful. In addition, he could not completely intercept and draw out all of the other party's providences. He could only take a part of it. For example, now, when the other party leaked their providences out of their bodies, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for him. However, he did not do so. His experience at the fish-leaping cliff told him that in the cultivation world, he had to have a sense of propriety and scale. There were countless such providences in the universe. He could not take all of them. Such an idea was very dangerous. He should form the habit of allowing others to have their providences. Moreover, he was afraid of alerting the other party. If the grassland people did not have any bad intentions, his actions would be immoral. If there was a conspiracy, he might alert the other party without knowing anything. It was better to be quiet. The ritual was still going on. He noticed that the 9 cultivators who had fate clusters stopped after they forced out more than 30% of their own fate clusters. Their fate clusters were taken to a faraway place by the faith of hundreds of thousands of grassland people. The grassland people were becoming more and more crazy. Their faith was becoming more and more intense. Could it be sent further? Lu Xiaoyi danced with the gradually crazy believers around him. He hid his providences deeply and also suppressed his cultivation to the lowest level with the divine concealment spell. It was difficult to hide his cultivation level in front of cultivators of the same level. He could do it because he was far enough away, and there were enough believers. Their auras were mixed, and the magi were focused on their own matters. 2 hours later, there was a mysterious fluctuation in the sky. 3 streaks of fate descended from the sky and landed on 3 of the 8 shamans on the high platform. The 3 of them were overjoyed, but the other 5 were disappointed. This was the end. The so-called spring sacrifice was not to pray for the ordinary grassland people. It was to calculate their own providences. Lu Xiaoyi judged and roughly understood a few points. Providence could be transferred. The specific method was unknown. Providence could not be transferred at the level of the grassland people. It was not even something that great magi and magi ancestors could do. Otherwise, they would not need to use such a large number of people. Wouldn't it be better if they closed the door? Could it be a certain faction that could transfer the light from Providence? Some kind of treasure? Some totem? The level must be very high. At the very least, he had no conclusion about it. He couldn't even make a guess. The transfer of Providence wasn't a guaranteed success. There was a problem with the success rate. For example, these shamans had sent 9 balls of Providence to an unknown place, but only 3 of them returned. Simply put, there was only a 30% chance of success. But what did it matter? The spring sacrificial rites were held every year. If they persevered, there would be a day when everyone would be blessed with Providence. This was the first time that Lu Xiaoyi and Fang Zihui had met face to face since they arrived at the grassland half a year ago. "You're still here? He didn't leave? Just to keep an eye on us?" Xiao Fang was furious, but fortunately, after his experience in the grassland, he had become much more mature. It's observation and protection, not surveillance. Also, I have good news for you. I'm leaving. Fan Zihui was enlightened. He was not stupid. This young man's unreasonable behavior made him realize something. You were sent by the dojo. My ancestor from the Fan family also seemed to have a person who had entered Dao, although it wasn't recorded in the family tree. Is that the reason? Lu Xiaoyi didn't comment. He just stuffed something the size of a button into Fan Zihui's hand. Only you can crush this thing. If there's a threat to your life that you can't handle, crush it. This is a reward for promoting the culture of the Central Plains. It has nothing to do with anything else. Fan Zihui watched him leave and muttered in his heart, what kind of danger can I be in? But he still shouted a thank you to the person who was leaving. No matter how annoying this person was, he was able to persist here for half a year and protect him from the beginning. This duty was worthy of respect, although he didn't care. Lu Xiaoyi returned to Shao Mountain and continued his cultivation. He didn't rush himself and lived a carefree life. But he still paid some attention to the news from two aspects. One was the news from the East Sea. The sect of 5 elements was in charge of the Thousand Chances Valley. This was expected. The so-called cultivation world was like this. As long as there was no force that could surpass the sect of 5 elements in the East Sea, the winner would take all. This was the iron law of the cultivation world. This was not the key. According to a reliable source, the sect of 5 elements borrowed a treasure from the 3 pure ones in order to restore the underground spiritual vigor of the Thousand Chances Valley to reverse the adverse impact Chaodong had on the ley lines of the Thousand Chances Valley. In this regard, Xianyuan was too far away to help. The other aspect was the history of the grassland. From tens of thousands of years ago, there were grievances between the northern region and Xianyuan. He found that the grassland tribe was really a persevering tribe. In a long time, they were suppressed countless times, but every time they were cut off by Xianyuan. But they never remembered the lesson. After thousands of years, they would return to their old ways. He could understand Xuanyuan's approach. The purpose of not destroying the grassland tribe was to provide a tough opponent for the swordsmen in Shao Mountain. If the northern region was too peaceful, it might not be a good thing for the swordsmen. He had also discussed this with Nan Jinren. Uncle! I also went to the grassland once for personal affairs. I always feel that the grassland people's change is somewhat inexplicable. This is not in line with the character of the grassland people. What do you think? Could it be that they're up to something? Do they have a big plan? Nan Jinren nodded. You can see this point. You are quite knowledgeable. Very good. The grassland people are a pack of wolves raised by Xianyuan. When the wolf pack is in its heyday, we will find an excuse to weaken them. When they are weak, we don't mind giving them hundreds of years to recover. When the wolf pack changes its character and learns to learn from humans, it is a sign of danger. Lu Xiaoyi was not surprised by Nan Jinren's answer. If he could think of it, there was no reason that Nan Jinren, who had been in charge of this place for hundreds of years, could not think of it. It was good to be mentally prepared. His problem was how to express his concern without revealing the problem of fate. But a plan needs to be supported by strength. Xianyuan has developed to this point, and it can no longer be subverted by a mere scheme. Shao Mountain, the Dome, and many senior swordsman groups, these are the biggest protection of Xianyuan. The grassland people are difficult to infiltrate, and they never accept outsiders. But we don't need to waste time guessing. We only need to keep an eye on their senior sorcerers. How many of them have become senior sorcerers? How many of them have become sorcerer ancestors? This is a red line, and when the line is crossed, Xianyuan will take action. So, you don't need to worry about this. Chapter 604. What about the scholars who went to spread the culture of the Central Plains? He was still confused. Nan Jinren smiled. It was a good thing that his disciple was willing to use his brain. He didn't mind explaining things more clearly. Jean Dan was the backbone of a sect. There were some things he should know. Strategy. If you can teach one, it's one. A single spark can start a prairie fire. Why stop it? The people of the grassland have only been in contact with the outside world for a few hundred years. The process is extremely slow. Whether they really want to integrate into the cultivation environment of Qing Kong, or it's just an illusion, we need time to see clearly. You have to know that the schemes in the cultivation world can easily take hundreds or thousands of years. It doesn't matter, they can do it, we can wait. For us swordsmen, as long as we have our strength, what can't we solve? In the cultivation world, massacring a city and destroying a sect was a great cause and effect. This was not like the war in the mortal world, where corpses were scattered everywhere. Mortals didn't receive superhuman strength from the heavenly Tao and didn't have a lifespan that exceeded the normal range. Even if they did, they would be punished by the heavenly Tao. But it was different for cultivators. When they received superpowers, they had to be restrained in some aspects for balance. Just like in the northern region, Xianyuan kept the grassland forces. First, they were the swordsmen needed to train their disciples. Second, Xianyuan could destroy the power of the grassland's witch priests, but he couldn't destroy a human race physically. This was a fundamental difference. In the history of cultivation, there was no precedent of physical destruction, but there were many successful cultural annihilations. For example, the Five Rings and the Serious People were the best examples. The Taoist school of Taoism was unique, but they had never directly destroyed a race or even a Taoist orthodoxy. They had always achieved their goals through a long period of time. This was the true essence of Taoism, which was why the Taoist school of Taoism had been able to flourish until now. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He understood his position from the conversation with Taoist Nan. He quietly observed and waited for an opportunity to appear. No matter if it was an individual or a sect, he shouldn't rush to a conclusion. The heavenly Tao gave cultivators a longer life so that they would have more time to weigh the pros and cons. They didn't have to rush like mortals and lament that life was too short. It would take a long time for him to deepen his understanding of the clusters of providence. What he saw now was only the surface, and he didn't understand the internal connection at all. What was the change in Shaxing's luck when he formed his core? What was Bluebeard's background on Whirling Star? Now, the grassland people were included as well. When he finally connected all these doubts together, he might be able to get part of the truth. As for the ultimate thing, who could truly see through it? Not to mention a mere Jean Dan, even if he was a real immortal, so what? Lu Xiaoyi tossed aside these questions about the overall situation and focused his attention back on his own cultivation. His recent cultivation had been rather casual, and he was still working hard in accordance with the Dafa direction he had set for himself when he formed his core. This was his foundation. However, he could sense that he needed to make a breakthrough in the five elements, and not be satisfied with his current shallow understanding. During his battle against Taoist three purities, he could clearly sense the five elements suppressing him. This situation would only become more and more obvious as his cultivation increased. He had always been working hard in this area, but it was rather difficult for Jean Dan. They didn't have the ability to comprehend the Tao like Yuanying did, and Xuanyuan's swordsman attitude towards external objects made it so that they didn't have any artifacts to help them. During these past few years, Lu Xiaoyi's path of cultivation had been filled with both joy and sorrow. It was difficult to describe in a few words. The joy was that he had gradually succeeded in modifying his flying swords. Thunderclap for the Four Seasons, Qianjun for the Stormwall, Thunderclap for the Navy, and Dark God for Hidden Fragrance. This allowed him to completely break away from the awkwardness of using the Foundation establishment sword formation when he was still a Jean Dan cultivator. This had laid a solid foundation for increasing the power of his flying swords. He had finally found a vessel for the Baishan sword spirit. At the very least, he would no longer feel awkward when setting up sword formations. However, this fellow was still used to fighting with the other sword spirits for the vessel. This was a habit, and there was nothing he could do about it. The Big Dipper sword spirit had been advancing by leaps and bounds ever since he formed his core. This was because it was the sword spirit most suited to his master's technique. Just a few months ago, the Big Dipper sword spirit had surpassed the 4 seasons for the first time in the wave-bursting slope, and had become his main sword spirit. The luck-severing sword spirit was even more ethereal. This was not a sword spirit that could improve just by passing through the wave-bursting slope. No matter how hard it tried, it would not improve at all. Its improvement was only related to the fate it devoured. For example, when he communicated with nature's fate on planet Hassa, it directly increased the luck-severing sword spirit's level by 50. This was a rare sword spirit that focused on enlightenment. Since he did not need to use the sword chi in the sword case to break through, he placed this fellow in his sea of consciousness to help him hide his fate. Even on Mount Shao, it had never moved. Compared to his success with the flying swords, his progress with the sword case was not so smooth. This was because there was no precedent to follow. He wanted to modify his sword case into a sword case that could release swords under any circumstances. This still required detailed research. In the stomach of the sea demon, he also knew that the biggest obstacle that limited the release of swords from the sword case came from the suppression of the realm. This was the iron law of the cultivation world. There was nothing to be ashamed of. However, he was still unwilling to give up. He kept thinking, what if it was an inner swordsman who was swallowed? Would he still not be able to release a flying sword? He had been going in and out of Fan Lu because he wanted to find a way to finally get rid of the sword case. He did not expect the flying sword to become an existence like the sword pill. However, if he could keep the flying sword in his body and use the human body as a sword case, this would be the first attempt among external swords. He did not know if other external swords had thought of this, but he had seriously thought about it. This was also a long process. Not only did it involve the modification of the flying sword, but it also involved the modification of his own body. In this regard, he had no clue. It was just a vague dream. With a dream, he had to at least lay a good foundation for it. In these years, Lu Xiaoyi had put in a lot of effort in the area of physical skills. His astral body was divided into 4 stages: the Emperor Star Body, the 7 stars shine together, the Northern Star Arch, and the Stellar Transposition. However, it was not particularly restricted to the realm. For example, he was now close to the peak of the Emperor Star Body. He estimated that he would reach the late stage of Jin Dan if he was fast, and the early stage of Yuanying if he was slow. He would reach the stage of the 7 stars shine together. Body cultivation was a martial art path that consumed a lot of time and energy. There were no shortcuts, and it was impossible to comprehend it overnight. It could only be done step by step. This was also a major characteristic of the body meridians. It was slow and solid. To a certain extent, the only things that could speed up this process were the environment of the stars and objects outside the stars. Unfortunately, Lu Xiaoyi did not have either. Chapter 605. What he was stuck on was the 5 elements. Not only did it include the application of sword techniques to the 5 elements, it also included the direction of escape techniques. In essence, it was because his understanding of the 5 elements was not deep enough. This caused his flying sword to only have the shape of the 5 elements, but not the meaning of the 5 elements. It was fine to use it, but it was not enough to fight against people, such as the 3 Taoist 3 purities in the Eastern Sea. In this aspect, he only considered the practical results, but never considered that they had already been immersed in the Jin Dan stage for hundreds of years. Actually, he didn't need to be in such a hurry. Once he had lived for hundreds of years, his attainments in the 5 elements would not be lower than theirs. However, the swordsman profession was too pretentious, and he himself was even more pretentious. The 5 elements were the foundation of the foundation. Like yin and yang, it was a hurdle that cultivators could not avoid. The 5 elements were more tangible, while yin and yang were more intangible. Together, they formed the solid foundation of the Zionist world. Generally speaking, in the Jin Dan stage, cultivators would place more emphasis on the tangible 5 elements, because they could be seen and touched. In the Zionist world, there was no conclusion as to when a cultivator would come into contact with the basic theories of the Tao realm. The general consensus was that after Yuanying, this was suitable for most Tao realm cultivators. Things like chaos, fate, time, and space were not things that mid to low level cultivators could understand. If one was obsessed with these things, their gains would be limited, and it would be useless. However, this did not include the 5 elements and yin and yang. The Zionist world's consensus was that these 2 Tao realms should come into contact with each other from the Jin Dan stage. Even if one could not grasp the essence, one should at least grasp the surface. On one hand, it would lay a good foundation for one's future path, and on the other hand, it would be of great help to a Jin Dan cultivator's battle prowess. Ever since Lu Xiaoyi had gained initial awareness of the 5 elements under Reverend Ray's hands, he had also fully developed this knowledge on planet Hassa. Unfortunately, planet Hassa's transformation time was limited, and he did not have much time. Therefore, his current situation was that he had always been in the initial awareness stage, which was probably the stage of initial awareness. If he went any further, he would return to the speed of an old ox pulling a broken cart. The flower festival that was held once every few years on Elder Ending Peak, it was unknown how many years it would last. It could be a year, or 10 years. It all depended on one's mood. How many people would there be? Because no one knew when someone would be gone, or if they were unhappy, they just wouldn't participate. To these old monsters, there was no fixed number at all. It was just a gathering for their own entertainment. Old Man Huang was very proud of himself. His flowers were the best among the few old men, but there was no audience because everyone else had left in a hubbub, not giving him a chance to show off. Only Lu Xiaoyi was flattering him below. He had been supporting her for many years. He had long since changed from having a purpose to purely looking for fun. Old Man Huang looked at the only spectator. "Do you know why I won in the end?" Lu Xiaoyi said disdainfully. "Isn't that all thanks to this disciple's contribution over the past few days? I'm so full that my stomach has swelled." Old Man Huang shook his head. "You only know one thing, but not the other. This old man won not because of how good my gardening is, but because of my peers." He pointed in the direction that the few old men had left. "They just can't let go of their airs as swordsmen. They're always using things like Tao heart, comprehension, and spiritual sustenance to raise flowers. Flowers are flowers. Can they understand what you're saying? The most important things for flowers are water and fertilizer. They're the simplest, most superficial, and most effective. Although they don't look presentable." He put away the flowers and walked away. He sighed as he walked. "This is actually the same principle as cultivation. This is also a major weakness of swordsmen. They're obsessed with mental cleanliness. They only want to use methods that don't touch external things to achieve their goals. That's the best and purest way. Actually, after a flower blooms, who knows if you're communicating with it or if it's fertilized? The most important thing is the goal. External things. Who doesn't use external things? You observe the sky at night and occasionally feel something, but you don't use external things? Then the stars in the sky, the touch of nature, aren't they external things? Why deceive yourself and others? They're all external things. It's just that the difference is external material objects and external illusory objects. When external illusory objects can't solve the problem, then look for external material objects. Actually, the flowers that are planted are all the same. Why do you have to use the most difficult method to ask yourself for everything? That's why my flowers are the best. Because I'm the most practical." Lu Xiaoyi was stunned. Old Man Huang's words were obviously implying something. He was once a peak Yuanying. Of course, he could see Lu Xiaoyi's current situation. Then, what he meant was, "I'll probably have to go to the Eastern Sea." Lu Xiaoyi made a request to Nanjinren. Old Man Huang gave him a concept. Since they're external things, why can't he have external material objects if he wants external illusory objects? If a meat pie fell on your head, it's an opportunity. But if it fell on someone else's courtyard, why isn't it an opportunity if you touch it yourself? If you don't take the initiative to pursue it, how many meat pies will fall on your head in your life? Just because of that so-called noble and self-restraint. After going to the Eastern Sea, contact this person. This way, we can find you in the shortest time possible. If there's a difficult task, we can still find you. Nanjinren didn't ask him the specific reason. This was the respect between cultivators. He just gave him an important hidden post. Lu Xiaoyi knew that this wasn't a task that really required him to come back. No matter how tense Mount Yi was, a few Jin Dan swordsmen could be gathered. If one wasn't enough, then a few more would go. Before Lu Xiaoyi came, Mount Yi didn't collapse. The main purpose of giving him a hidden post was to have the fastest information channel when he was in danger. You're not going to ask me what I'm going to do? Nanjinren shook his head. How old are you? You still want us yuanying old men to ask about your well-being? What's dangerous, what's safe, what's worth, what's not worth, what should be done, what shouldn't be done? I don't need anyone to teach me. Lu Xiaoyi nodded and left. In fact, Nanjinren still had some misunderstandings. He thought that he was going to the Eastern Sea to take revenge for almost being eaten by the demon last time. But he underestimated Lu Xiaoyi. He didn't care about that little bit of revenge anymore. Everything was for the sake of better cultivation. He tidied up the cave a little. If everything went well, he might not come back for a few years. He happened to meet the ice guest who was standing in front of the cave. He was here to deliver daily necessities and tidy up the house for him. He persisted for several years and never gave up. It was rare for him to have such a heart of apprenticeship. Unfortunately, he didn't know how to teach apprentices. And he felt that this guy wasn't about apprenticeship now. It was about the state of mind. Do you have anything to do recently? The ice guest said respectfully. I'm preparing to form my essence. It's just that I don't have any clue, so I'm quite free. Lu Xiaoyi thought for a while and decided to force this guy out. With his preparation, he wouldn't get anything even if he prepared until he died. I have something I need you to do. In the grassland there's a couple. I might not be able to come back for a while, so I need someone to help me look after them. But you have to remember, don't easily reveal the secret of Xianyuan. Just report back in time if something happens. Chapter 606. This time, Lu Xiaoyi went to the East Sea without using the teleportation formation. He was naturally uneasy about it. Even if it was only for a moment, the feeling of not being able to control himself made him uncomfortable. This was a feeling that every cultivator who had the desire to control would have, and he was not the only one. This time, he was familiar with the road and did not bring the big-mouthed egret. He just used the stellar escape to travel straight. His speed was much faster than the last time. It only took him 2 months to get close to the East Sea. However, this time, it was his personal business, and he needed to keep it a secret. He could not swagger around like last time. Therefore, when he was 1,000 miles away from the East Sea, he used the spirit convergence technique that he had practiced to perfection. He also wore the straw hat given to him by the king of Weijian Mountain and became a foundation establishment cultivator. He mingled with the countless foundation establishment cultivators near the sea. To the huge East Sea coast, he was an invincible invasion. He was familiar with the East Sea, but the first thing he needed to do was to complete the Nanjinren's order and meet the spy. Lu Xiaoyi also considered whether he should act alone and not leave any traces. However, he quickly dismissed this idea. If he did not see the spy, it meant that he did not trust the Nanjinren. After being in Xianyuan for so long, whether it was the Five Rings or Mount Yi, he really had no reason to not trust his own sect. This was the mark of time. He had now regarded himself as a real swordsman. Acting alone was a character, and trust was the cornerstone. There was no conflict. This time, the name given by the Nanjinren was different from the last time. It was obviously more confidential. If the Nanjinren could trust him, how could he not trust him? The meeting took him more than 10 days. It was just a backup, a temporary place to stay if something happened. He did not reveal his real purpose, and the Nanjinren did not ask. This was the basic common sense in a foreign land. One day, a strange Taoist came to the Fengshou town outside the Thousand Chants Valley. He wore a straw hat and looked travel-worn. Plentiful Harvest Town was the closest town to the Thousand Chants Valley for mortals. There were many market squares in the town, and most of them were medicinal pills. As the saying goes, those who rely on the mountain eat the mountain, those who rely on the river eat the water. What else could one eat when relying on the Thousand Chants Valley? Of course, it was medicinal pills, as well as anything related to alchemy, including all kinds of rare herbs and spirit plants. The cultivation environment of the people of the East Sea was much stronger than that of the other provinces. The residents of the town were not surprised by the cultivators coming in and out of the town. Cultivators like Lu Shui, every day there would be dozens of them. They were all here to ask for pills, which made the business of Harvest Town, even in the mortal world, extremely prosperous. Lu Shui stayed here for several days. On the surface, he went to the various shops every day to pick and choose, but in reality, his mind was not on these things. He was carefully inspecting the earth veins and making the final preparations for his next move. A few days later, he left Plentiful Harvest Town and continued to advance towards the Thousand Chants Valley. At this time, he had to be very careful. The Thousand Chants Valley had been seized by the Five Elements sect for several years, and it was in a period of time where there were many things waiting to be done. The surrounding people and forces who came to steal chickens and dogs had not completely stopped, and the defensive patrols were quite strict. Lu Xiaoyi relied on his astonishing mental power to detect the arrival of cultivators in advance, so his journey could be considered smooth. However, this situation could not continue for more than 10 li from the Thousand Chants Valley. The Five Elements sect had recently set up a large alert formation here. Although it had not been set up for a long time and was still somewhat rough, Lu Xiaoyi did not want to take the risk. He had a better way to enter. He carefully laid down in a ditch outside the alert formation. After confirming that there were no traces of people in the surroundings, he took out the strange stone core and held it in his hand. He silently used the earth escape technique, and his whole body gradually sank into the soil and disappeared. The earth escape technique was the most difficult of the Five Elements escape techniques. The so-called Five Elements escape technique, in fact, did not completely refer to the Five Elements escape technique in the 5 different elements. Instead, it referred to the Five Elements escape technique in the surrounding environment. It was determined by the strength of the Five Elements escape technique in the surrounding environment. For example, in the forest, if the wood element escape technique was more advantageous. In the desert, if the fire element escape technique was more suitable. The fire escape technique did not completely refer to the fire escape technique, but the wood escape technique was to drill a hole in the wood. However, there were also unexpected situations, such as in the water, which was completely comparable to the water escape technique. Another example was to drill into the soil. Lu Xiaoyi's Five Elements escape technique was at best at the small success stage. The extent of what he could do was very limited. In terms of escape technique, it could not replace his main escape technique, the star escape technique. In battle, it could also not replace his set of sword technique. At most, it could be used as a supplement. In terms of the earth escape technique, purely relying on his own ability, he could only drill a few feet into the ground. This was under the condition that the soil was not too hard. Although the Thousand Opportunities Valley was not big, it was still a few hundred miles long. If he wanted to reach the wondrous stone pillar's location, even if he did not consider the obstructions along the way, with his turtle speed, he was afraid that it would take years. Because he was very shallow, it was also very easy to be detected. However, if he had the help of the wondrous stone core, everything would be different. This thing could guide him to the softest path in the soil and greatly increase his earth escape technique. It could also help him conceal his own spiritual opportunity. This was because in the Thousand Opportunities Valley, the wondrous stone was the real master. After being planted here for tens of thousands of years, the wondrous stone had already become one with the soil. Not only could it control the Thousand Opportunities Valley for several hundred miles, if it wanted to, it could even expand its influence to 1,000 miles away. This was the benefit that Enchaodong told him. He did not come here to cause destruction. He did not have a cultivator target, nor did he have a geographical target. Destroying the Thousand Opportunities Valley and not being able to grow it was meaningless to him and Xian Yuan. After hearing Old Man Huang's words, he understood a few things. Borrowing external objects was not shameful. Everyone was borrowing in different ways. You could not say that borrowing the natural environment, the mental state, or the stars, these illusory things were high-end. However, borrowing physical objects was shameful and vulgar, so the final result would be inferior to others. No matter how you borrowed it, or what you borrowed, as long as you achieved your goal, it was the same 5 elements. There was no such thing as me borrowing an object to comprehend the 5 elements compared to you comprehending the 5 elements overnight. They were all natural principles, and there was no difference between the two. Just as Enchaodong told him, he came here to borrow the wondrous stone's 5 elements to enhance his understanding of the 5 elements. Blindly thinking about the 5 elements could not be understood. It was just an armchair strategist. Only by experiencing the changes of the 5 elements at a close distance could he truly understand the profound principles of the transformation of the 5 elements. The azure sky big world was a stable and balanced boundary. It had been a long time, so it was impossible for there to be any drastic changes for him to refer to. Under normal circumstances, cultivators could only spend time to understand the principles of the 5 elements through long periods of observation. The advantage of the Thousand Opportunities Valley was that the old fox and Chaodong had destroyed 30% of the Thousand Opportunities Valley's 5 elements. To repair it, it had to be operated, and during the operation, the rare secrets of the 5 elements would be revealed. Chapter 607. Now, he was hiding 500 feet under the soil. At this depth, even if the Jin Dan cultivators deliberately searched for him, they would not be able to find him. With the cover of the strange stone, his speed was not comparable to flying, but it was not like a tortoise crawling, but a mortal running speed. With this speed, he could probably reach his destination in about a day. On Whirling Star, he had the experience of comprehending the 5 elements. So after understanding Old Huang's advice, he felt that he could come here to speed up the speed of comprehending the 5 elements. At the same time, he reminded himself how terrible vanity was in the cultivation world, and how noble and virtuous would harm others and oneself. Dharma Meridian cultivators looked noble and virtuous, but they were everywhere. It could be seen that their nobility was for others to see. The true attitude of a cultivator was to fight if they could, but they must not fish for fame, and in the end, they would become a joke in the eyes of others. The strange stone core was a good thing. At that time, Enchaodong had thoughtfully included the magical effects of the strange stone core, which was to bet that he would not be satisfied. The old man did not misjudge him. In fact, he had enough experience and vision. Who didn't cultivate the 5 elements in the Jin Dan? In such a stable domain like the blue sky, except for the Divine Design Valley, where else could there be such an opportunity? Since he was here, how could he not have more or less conflicts with the current owner of the Thousand Design Valley? Everything was logical, and it satisfied the old man's desire for revenge. He would not be at peace even if he died. In the nameless valley at the core of the Thousand Design Valley, above the strange stone array, there was a small mountain suspended in the air. The mountain was divided into 5 colors, and light was flowing. It was the Five Elements Mountain that the Five Elements sect borrowed from the Tai Ching branch of the Three Pure Taoist sect. The mountain, from top to bottom, consisted of water, fire, metal, wood, and earth, each occupying hundreds of feet, like 5 colorful rings between the mountain, which was spectacular. The most amazing thing was that this combination of colors was not fixed. At the edge of each of the 5 elements, cyan was swallowing red, red was eroding iron gray was penetrating green, and green was penetrating the khaki. Finally, the khaki at the bottom expanded into cyan from the top. Every other day, after 24 hours, this mutual erosion would come to an end, and the entire mountain would turn into earth, water, fire, metal, and wood from top to bottom. Then, another round of erosion would begin, and this cycle would repeat. This was the ultimate principle of the 5 elements reinforcing and restraining each other. The suspended 5 Elements Mountain and the 5 Elements Mystic Rock buried in the Thousand Opportunities Valley were the 2 great 5 Elements treasures of the Azure Sky Great World. Neither was stronger than the other, but their effects were different. The 5 Elements Mountain was the treasure of the Grand Clear sect. Its main function was to provide for the sect's cultivators to study the 5 elements, and it was not easily shown to others. The 5 Elements Wondrous Stone was rooted in the Thousand Opportunities Valley, nourishing and changing the spiritual vigor of the Thousand Opportunities Valley. In the end, it merged with the entire valley. In terms of function, the Wondrous Stone could not be taken away. Whoever occupied the Thousand Opportunities Valley would own it. This was where Lady Anne felt that she was at a disadvantage. There were 2 people in the valley. One was Mei who controlled the Wondrous Stone, and the other was Taoist Yu Chang from the Grand Clear sect. However, they did not have anything to do with the 5 Elements sect. This was a very normal thing. The Wondrous Stone could not be controlled by Lady Anne's blood, and the 5 Elements Mountain was the treasure of the Grand Clear sect. How could it be easily handed over to an outsider? Borrowing was borrowing, but the specific operation had to be done by Taoist Yu Chang. There was no reason for others to do it. As for the restoration of the spiritual field in the Thousand Opportunities Valley, although Old Master and Chowdong only damaged 30%, this was the result of the Wondrous Stone adjusting the 5 elements for tens of thousands of years. It was impossible to restore it just like that, and it needed a lot of time. After the experts of the 5 Elements sect studied it, they found that it would take at least a few hundred years to restore 90% of the original state. If it was completely restored, it would take at least 1,000 years. How could they wait that long? They painstakingly planned, paid, and communicated with many parties for the sake of this little output of the Thousand Opportunities Valley. Now that they finally got it, they lost part of its effect. It especially affected the growth of some older medicinal plants. Not to mention 1,000 years, a large part of it would die in just a few hundred years. This was intolerable. Hence, they thought of asking for help from their allies, the 3 Pure Ones. Borrowing the Grand Clear sect's 5 Elements Sacred Mountain and cooperating with the Wondrous Stones Array, they could greatly speed up the restoration of the Thousand Opportunities Valley. This led to the arrival of Taoist Yu Chang and the cooperation of Mei, who had been doing the restoration work. With the Wondrous Stone as the main operation and the 5 Elements Sacred Mountain as the supplement, the 5 elements resonated with each other, and the divine power was connected. The power of the 2 treasures combined to make up for the loss of the spiritual vigor of the spiritual field in the Thousand Opportunities Valley. This was a boring task. And Mei had no choice because the future of the clan was in the hands of others. Whether it was good or bad depended on whether she contributed or not. For people who did not understand the 5 elements, this was a good task. It could help them deepen their understanding of the 5 elements. However, for Mei, this was something she was used to. The clan's inheritance came from Chong Huang. Chong Huang's understanding of the 5 elements was basically focused on the Tao of pills. However, unlike other orthodoxies, they did not expand the application of the 5 elements to a wide range, such as making tools, drawing talismans, fighting, and so on. Hence, it was somewhat boring. Taoist Yu Chang was not bored. Because he came with a mission. Allies were allies, schemes were schemes. His mission was to find a way to use the 5 elements' sacred mountain to finally achieve the goal of controlling the wondrous stone. Of course, this was a secret in private. On the surface, it was to help restore the spiritual vigor of the Thousand Opportunities Valley. This kind of mission was actually very difficult for a Yuanian cultivator. It would be best if a supreme was sent to do it. However, the 5 Elements sect was not stupid. The sect was named the 5 Elements. It went without saying where their orthodoxy was good at. If they sent a supreme to cooperate with Jin Dan, it would definitely arouse the suspicions of the 5 Elements sect. Hence, they could only send the Yuchang Taoist, who was the most proficient in the 5 elements among the Yuanian cultivators. With the 5 elements sacred mountain, the restoration was not something that could be done overnight. It still needed time, especially when the Yuchang Taoist did not fully cooperate. His goal was to find a way to control the wondrous stone. As for the restoration of the spiritual field, that was a secondary problem. The restoration was carried out in this kind of dragging and scheming. There was progress, but it was not big. It was far from the expectations of the 5 Elements sect. They also could not say anything. The 2 wondrous stones were not something that they could meddle with. They could only watch. In the cultivation world, patience was a must. Battles could be measured in breaths or seconds. However, this kind of deep-level 5 elements transformation was not something that could be rushed. In order to change the characteristics of the Thousand Opportunities Valley's earth veins, the wondrous stone had been used for tens of thousands of years. It had already completely taken root in this land. It could mobilize the power of the earth veins for thousands of miles at any time. It was much more powerful than the 5 elements sacred mountain that had no foundation. Therefore, although it was also a 5 elements treasure, in the special terrain of the Thousand Opportunities Valley, the wondrous stone's power was stronger than the 5 elements sacred mountain. This was also the reason why the Yuchang Taoist was frowning. Chapter 608. The Yue Path people had been waiting for some change. As long as there was a change, he could take advantage of it. But the strange stone was rooted in the earth, and its own power of the 5 elements was strong. Under the control of Jin Dan, it was invulnerable. If it was just a matter of time, he could naturally gain control of the strange stone after 100 years. But being trapped in this place for 100 years was disadvantageous to his cultivation. Even if he was a Yuanian with a lifespan of close to 1,200 years, 100 years was a time that could not be ignored. Moreover, how could he show his ability as the best in the Tai Ching Yuanian group? He was waiting, and also looking for a suitable breakthrough. Through controlling the 5 elements sacred mountain, he could control the mysteries of the changes of the 5 elements. In theory, his level of insight was not comparable to a little Jin Dan. There was no comparison at all. But in practice, he found that he was like a dog biting a porcupine, and there was nowhere to bite. And Ming Mei was very smart. She did not compete in cultivation, knowledge, or understanding of the 5 elements. She had an advantage over the strange stone that was rooted in Thousand Chance Valley. An even greater power of the 5 elements. The main operation was taught to the strange stone itself, and she rarely interfered. In this way, as the main body of the repair, how could the strange stone, a natural spiritual object, be defeated in the hands of a mere Yuanian? She was unconscious. Of course, everything was for the sake of the Thousand Chances Valley. However, the more unconscious she was, the more anxious the man from the Yuchang sect was. He even thought about how to instigate this Jin Dan from the Yin family. However, they hadn't been together for a long time. The hidden and visible attention of the 5 elements sect made him unable to do it. To be able to rise in the Eastern Sea, the 5 elements sect could be said to be full of talents. The only thing they lacked was the foundation. Their foresight and strategy were not bad at all. They knew that among the 2 people in the valley, Ming Mei was truly harmless, while the three pure ones were tigers and wolves that had not bared their fangs. On this day, the two felt a slight change in the strange stone at the same time. It was not obvious, and was completely within the normal range. It was just a fluctuation in the power of the five elements. And Ming Mei was very alert. "Master Yue! Can you stop the operation? I want to do a comprehensive inspection of the strange stone, as long as it is within the range of Thousand Chance Valley." The Yue Path people were very disdainful. "What is there to inspect? Wasting time." There were all sorts of strange changes in the underground five elements, and there were all sorts of inducing factors. Deep cracks in the ground, cave collapses, spirit veins obstructing the flow of underground water, the tides of the stars, the influence of time, and even a few pangolins drilling holes at the right time could cause similar minor changes. Every time there's a change, you have to investigate thoroughly and interrupt it. Then, the restoration will take a long time. You can wait here for hundreds of years, but we, the three pure ones, don't have the time to accompany you. And Ming Mei insisted, "Master Yu, wondrous stones are spiritual objects of heaven and earth. They wouldn't change for no reason. It's even more impossible for them to make a mistake on their own accord, without investigating the cause, even if it's just a few tiny pangolins." Yu Chang scolded. "Shut up. Do you know why your orthodoxy has fallen to such a state?" They were unchanging, conformist, overcautious, and overcautious. To put it bluntly, they lacked confidence. "I have already made up my mind. I will continue to operate without any changes. I don't believe that with the two strange objects of heaven and earth, there's still something that can go wrong." In the restoration of Thousand Chance Valley, of course, the strange stone was the main treasure, and the five elements' sacred mountain was the supplement. However, in terms of people, Yu Chang, the Taoist Yuanying, was the leader. This was inevitable. Since he insisted, and Ming Mei couldn't resist. Who asked her to be disappointing? Who asked her orthodoxy to be disappointing? What kind of tough words could she say? However, what Yu Chang said wasn't unreasonable. It was just that their attitudes were different. The three pure ones cultivators wanted to advance triumphantly and fight for time, while she wanted to fight steadily and not make any mistakes. Their starting point was different. Of course, she didn't know that the so-called fight for time was actually more focused on how to control the strange stone. Controlling the strange stone was something that cultivators couldn't do, but the five elements' sacred mountain could. In the end, it was equivalent to the three pure ones cultivators controlling the strange stone through controlling the five elements' sacred mountain. What Yu Chang needed was a change, an accident. Even if it was just a little bit, it was a loophole that could be exploited. Only then could they expand through this loophole, and finally grasp the weakness of the strange stone, waiting for an opportunity to control it. Lu Xiaoyi finally touched the bottom of the strange stone. Fortunately, thanks to the cover of the strange stone, no one thought that there was a human intruder here. At most, they would think that he was a pangolin who accidentally bumped into it. He wouldn't think of running out of the ground. He knew that someone was operating the strange stone formation. Wouldn't he be looking for exposure if he went out? He didn't need to go out to comprehend the five elements. Instead, it was better to directly touch the strange stone underground. This was the result of the special environment of Thousand Chance Valley, with the earth vein as the foundation. The environment was a bit harsh, equivalent to being buried alive. However, as long as there was spiritual opportunity, he didn't care. He didn't need food, water, air, or space. He was more dead than the living dead in the ancient tomb. He was like a zombie that sealed all of his breath and only extended his perception. With the help of the strange stone core, he silently understood how the strange stone converted the spiritual opportunity of the other four elements into earth element spiritual opportunity. He didn't participate, at least not now. He needed to first understand the mechanism of the strange stone's operation, and then talk about other things. Time passed slowly in his silent experience. Lu Xiaoyi's perception also became more and more distant as his understanding of the strange stone deepened. His knowledge and comprehension were also gradually enriched by the comparison between theory and practice. He turned the things in books and other people's things into his own things. This was cultivation, and not just fighting and killing. When he thoroughly grasped these natural principles, he would then expand to the application. For example, the yellow worship people used it to make pills, the three pure ones used it to make talismans, and the Xianyuan people used it to kill people. The 5 elements. The opportunity of creation couldn't be without life, and it couldn't be without control. Without life, there would be no reason for development, and without control, there would be harm. In this way, the second generation and the second generation, the second generation and the second generation restrained each other. It was like a ring without end, and the biochemistry was endless. It maintained the dynamic balance between the universe and nature. Due to the mutual generation and restraint between the 5 elements, any line of the 5 elements would have 4 aspects of the relationship. I give birth to myself. I give birth to myself. I restrict myself. And I restrict myself. This was also the foundation of the 5 elements, and it was at the level that Lu Xiaoyi could understand now. Through the strange stone's repair of the Thousand Opportunities Valley's spiritual field, he discovered the law from it. How to create. How to restrain it. How to be reborn. How to be restrained. He also understood how to restrain it. How to not be restrained. How to be reborn. How to not be reborn. With all these applied to the sword, when the opponent's technique carried the 5 elements, how to restrain him with the smallest amount of strength. How to restrain him. Not to use stupid strength, blindly using force, not to mention the excessive consumption, there wouldn't be much effect. In the world, most techniques carried the 5 elements, and the higher one went, the more so it was. If a swordsman only used stupid strength, his path would be narrower and narrower, unless he went on the path of body cultivation. If he specialized in body cultivation, would he still be an agile swordsman? Chapter 609. Lu Xiaoyi spent 3 years to complete the basic understanding of the 5 elements, and evolved the concept to a deeper level of the 5 elements. The basic concept of the multiplication and mutual rejection between the 5 elements was first seen in the canon of internal medicine. It referred to the abnormal mutual rejection between the 5 elements after the destruction of the generation and restraint between the 5 elements. Multiplication. Multiplication means to use the strong to bully the weak. Multiplication in the 5 elements refers to a certain line of the 5 elements restraining the line of the 5 elements too much, causing a series of abnormal mutual rejection reactions. Mutual rejection. Rejection here refers to counter-rejection. Mutual rejection in the 5 elements refers to the fact that a certain line of the 5 elements is too strong, and the line of the original line of the 5 elements retaliates, so the reversal is also called counter-rejection. This is the in-depth expansion of the 5 elements. For example, wood is subdued by gold, but when wood is particularly strong, not only is it not subdued by gold, but it will counterattack, that is, counter-subduing, gold. This is called wood insults gold. This is one aspect of counterattack. On the other hand, it could also be because gold itself was very weak. Not only could it not restrain wood, but it was also attacked by wood. It was called metal void wood insults. Multiplication and mutual rejection are abnormal mutual rejection phenomena. There is both difference and connection between the two. The difference is that the former is a strong restraint according to the mutual restraint order of the 5 elements, which forms the abnormal generation and restraint between the 5 elements. The latter is a restraint phenomenon in the opposite direction from the mutual restraint order of the 5 elements, which forms the abnormal generation and restraint between the 5 elements. The connection is that when multiplication occurs, mutual rejection can also occur at the same time. When mutual rejection occurs, multiplication can also occur at the same time. If there is enough qi, it will restrain what it has won and bully what it has not won. If there is not enough qi, it will be used to bully what it has not won. This concept is very important for the cultivator to play the 5 elements in the battle. It is very close to the actual combat. In the ever-changing collision of the 5 elements, only by really mastering the essence of the 5 elements can one step ahead of the enemy in the instantaneous change and win. When a cultivator was immersed in the ocean of experience, time always passed very quickly. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed. Lu Xiaoyi, who felt that he had made great progress in the basic theory of the 5 elements, felt that he could test what he had learned by controlling the strange stone to a certain extent. Practice was the ultimate goal of theory. Applying what one had learned was a process that every cultivator had to go through. When his perception began to expand along the strange stone, Lu Xiaoyi was surprised to discover that there was another set of 5 elements system above the strange stone. He had been immersed in the changes of the 5 elements underground for 10 years, and he hadn't noticed this at all. He immediately realized what it was. It must be the 5 elements sacred mountain, a treasure from the 3 pure ones, that helped to repair the strange stone. No wonder the changes of the 5 elements of the strange stone were so complicated in the past 10 years, as if it was actively demonstrating to him. It turned out that the so-called multiplying and insulting each other was competing for control with another strange object. He was not too sure about the situation outside. How many cultivators were there? Who were they? What realm were they in? But he thought that they would not be lower than Jin Dan. It was impossible for such a precious 5 elements sacred mountain to not be guarded by high-level cultivators. Therefore, there might be Yuaning as well. He could not show himself, so he could only solve the problem of the 5 elements in the way of the 5 elements. He felt that he could do something. After 10 years of comprehension, not only did he understand the strange stone, but he also understood the 5 elements sacred mountain without knowing anything about it. At the very least, he was not unfamiliar with some of the rules of the 5 elements sacred mountain. This was shown in the high-level multiplication and discord. After all, a strange object was a strange object. It followed the instinctive law of the 5 elements for millions of years, which was in accordance with the Tao of Heaven. However, in terms of strange changes, it was not as cunning, changeable, and purposeful as humans. As long as he did not show too much human thinking, but more like a strange object, who could guess that there was a strange swordsman hiding in the core of the strange stone. He was wrapped in the core of the strange stone, so he was not afraid of the detection of spiritual awareness, even if it was Yuaning's spiritual awareness. In the past 10 years, he had a strong impulse to actively create the sword spirit of the 5 elements for the first time in his life during the transformation of the 5 elements. The impulse of a cultivator was never accidental. A high-level cultivator had a sudden impulse, and a low-level cultivator could sometimes intuit what he wanted to do. Therefore, there must be a reason for the impulse. But what had been restricting him was, could he really do it to the treasure of Chongwang, the last wish of Mizhen? And Chaodong told him that he could use it to practice the 5 elements. When Mizhen regained this place in the future, he could return the core of the strange stone, but he did not say that he could take the strange stone for himself. When he took the core of the strange stone, it was a promise, but now it was not good to go back on it. Because he could not predict whether the strange stone would lose its spirituality after he created the sword spirit. If it did not, it would be the best of both worlds. If the strange stone failed, he would be a person who reneged on his promise. But now, this obstacle was solved. He could not touch the strange stone, but he could touch the 5 elements sacred mountain without any psychological burden. He could take it with a clear conscience, and it could eliminate the resentment of being in the fish's belly. If it was before, he would consider the risk of doing so, and then evaluate the gains and losses. But now he would not. He had the thinking of a real swordsman, which was to do it and think it over. If he thought too much, he could not do anything. Therefore, in the normal operation of the 5 elements of the strange stone, he seized a certain opportunity, and suddenly led the 5 elements to a peak power. As Yu Chang said, there were many factors that affected the change of the 5 elements of the earth vein. Among them, the most important one was the fissure of the earth. What he simulated was the pulse of the earth fissure, which could cover up the signs of human manipulation to the greatest extent. In the grassland of the northern region, Bingku followed a caravan on the grassland. He remembered Master Lu's instructions, and never revealed his identity as a Xianyuan swordsman. He just pretended to be a traveling merchant in the Qi-eating stage, and regularly went between Shao Mountain and the grassland where the Stab tribe settled. Once every 3 years, this was Master Lu's arrangement for him. Bingku listened to Master Lu's words the most, and never crossed the line. This was both his advantage and his weakness. Every time he went to the grassland, he would choose to go in winter, because at this time, the herdsmen would return to the gathering place for winter, and he did not need to go around the world to find people. He could not expose his cultivation of Zhuji stage. Since he could not fly, it was too hard to find people by riding a horse. This was his own experience. If he wanted to pretend to be a real swordsman, he had to run a stall with real swords and spears. In the past 10 years, he had earned a lot of money, which was not worth mentioning for practitioners, but in the mortal world, it was also a big fortune, and also an extra gain. In order to pretend to be a real swordsman, and also to not waste the wealth, or maybe there were some other reasons, he also kept 2 women in the yurt in the grassland gathering place. Well, in order to avoid trouble, they were both widows, a pair of sisters-in-law. The men died in a white wind in the grassland, leaving the 2 women to live a hard life. Of course, Bingku felt that he was very sympathetic, but he felt that they were pitiful. In the grassland, there were more women than men, so he helped them if he could, but it did not involve other things. There was also a pair of sisters-in-law next door. Chapter 610. The caravan arrived safely. This trade route was rarely dangerous. Bingku was still very responsible. He went to check the yurt of the Fangs first. Well, now Fang Zihui was independent and had his own yurt. In the words of the prairie people, he was the head of the family. In fact, the biggest reason was that the original Xiao Fang had now become Fang Zihui. Now there were 2 little Fangs, the elder sister and the younger brother. They were at a lively and lovely age. Every year when he came here, the 2 children would be the first to run out to welcome him. Fang Fang, Yuan Yuan, look what good things I brought for you. But this time, there were some exceptions. When he shouted, the 2 children didn't run out. It was normal. Maybe they went out to play with other children. 7 or 8 years old children were at the age where they couldn't stay still. No one responded to him. Bingku had an idea and walked into the yurt. The prairie people didn't have the habit of locking things. Everything in the yurt was normal. Judging from the breath, there was still the breath of people, which meant that there were still people living here today. This made Bingku breathe a sigh of relief. If he failed the task assigned by Lu Shi, he wouldn't be able to become Lu Shi's disciple in this life. He reminded himself to calm down and not to make a fuss. In this season, it was common for the master to take the children out to visit. It was dinner time. He decided to wait. If no one came back in 2 hours, he would go to Fang Zihui's father-in-law's house. It was very likely that they were there. He comforted himself again. It would be fine. Half an hour later, Fang Zihui and his wife walked in one after another. Their steps were heavy. At this time, Fang Zihui was no longer the handsome young man. The wind of the prairie had changed him into the same as other prairie herdsmen. With a red and black face, dirty hairstyle, and a loose and greasy robe, no one would recognize that he was once a man from the Central Plains. Qing Duo was the same. The aging of the prairie women seemed to come especially early. It was unknown whether it was hereditary or the harsh environment here. Her eyes were no longer bright, Her figure was no longer slim, and her singing was no longer loud. Her thin waist was no longer the shadow of the famous prairie flower. More than 10 years, time had successfully changed people into another appearance. "I came to see the children. What's wrong? What happened?" In the gathering place of the prairie people, it was not that there was no crime, especially after drinking and having fun. But the crime here was generally very straightforward, without the twists and turns of the Central Plains people. Of course, it was also more bloody. But Fan Zhihui, as the cultural propagator of the Tudi tribe, was still respected by most of the prairie people, and no one would deliberately embarrass him. He was a link, representing a lot of things. Fan Zhihui sat on the blanket silently and didn't say anything. On the contrary, Qing Duo was the one who spoke her mind as usual. "Brother Bing, it's actually not a big deal. It might be a good thing for us prairie people. Here's the thing, it's a great thing for every grassland family that Lord Magus has come to our clan to choose a servant boy to serve us. It's an honor." This time, Lord Witchlord came and selected more than 10 children, including our families Fa Fang and Yuan Yuan. It should have been a happy occasion, but this stubborn donkey seemed to have taken the wrong medicine. He looked miserable all day long and went to the clan leader every day to ask for the return of his children. He even said that the children of the Central Plains should not casually serve the gods of the grasslands. Today, he went again and got beaten up. If it weren't for the fact that he had been diligent and sincere in the grasslands for more than 10 years, doing his best and being kind to others, it wouldn't be wrong to kill his whole family for the crime of blaspheming the Black Deer God. But look at him, he still doesn't repent. I'm just worried that he will go out and talk nonsense again and cause trouble, turning a good happy occasion into a disaster. Brother Bing, you are all from the Central Plains and can speak the same language. Why don't you persuade him and ask him to stop? When the children are successful in their studies and come back, they will still have a complete family. Qing Duo still didn't understand the people from the Central Plains, let alone the scholars. Although this didn't prevent them from loving each other, some things couldn't be changed by loving each other. Just like she would always be a grassland person, Fan Zhihui would always be a Central Plains person in his bones. He knew that it was impossible to persuade him, so when Qing Duo went to clean up the dinner, he asked quietly, "Are they still in the Tashi tribe? Or were they taken away? Where did they go?" Fan Zhihui said in a muffled voice, "They were taken away. They are in the Wolf Valley next to the Black Deer Plain. There are cavalrymen guarding that place. Ordinary people can't get in." Bing Ku was very doubtful. "Are you sure?" Fan Zhihui nodded. "Of course. This is not a secret in the grassland. It has been like this for tens of thousands of years. First, they learn from the shaman in the Wolf Valley, then they are eliminated. Tell me, if I have such needs, why would I come to the grassland? Isn't it better to send them to Xianyuan thousands of times than here?" Bing Ku was very serious. "Fan Zhihui, there is one thing you have to understand. Your imagination of bringing the child back home and living a good life with your family no longer exists. What is the status of the shaman in the grassland here? You know it better than me. Not to mention you, even the chief of the Tashi tribe can do whatever he wants. He is God. He is God. They would not show mercy to any of their clansmen because this was their supreme tradition. No one dares to go against the tradition. You can choose between the two paths. Or you can be willing to take this as an honor. You will have a good life and have a high status in the Tashi tribe. In the future, 1 or even 2 children may be eliminated and come back. Your family will be reunited. Or you must be prepared to leave. Take your family back to Snow's City. No, go back to Xianyuan City, then you will be safe. There is no third path." Fan Zhihui raised his head. "Go back to Xianyuan City? What about my children?" Bing Ku smiled. "Leave it to me. But you have to make a choice. I will only be able to do something after your family leaves. Otherwise, it will be meaningless." Fan Zihui thought for a while. Brother Bing, are you on the same side as Brother Lu? How can our Fang family be worthy of your help? Bingke did not know so much. He was just a coolie who was dragged here by Master Lu. But now was not the time to show his cowardice. If he wanted to maintain his position, he had to pretend to be mysterious. You don't need to know these. You just need to make a decision and tell me. Leaving Fang Zihui, who was still in deep thought, Bingke turned around and left with an arrogant look. When he got out of the yurt, his face immediately fell. He knew very well that he could not do anything by himself. He could not break into the Wolf Valley. Not to mention the possible advanced Jin Dan shaman. How many shamans of the same level as him could he deal with? 1 or 2 would be fine, but more would be troublesome. The Wolf Valley was the training ground of the grassland people. How could there be few shamans? Unfortunately, Master Lu had left for 10 years without any news. Could it be that he had died somewhere? That was too unlucky. Bingke spat. He had not even acknowledged him as his teacher. How could he die? If he died, it should be after he acknowledged him as his teacher. He had a lot of troubles himself. The goods did not matter. But it was a pity to give up the 2 women. There were still 2 sisters-in-law diagonally across the street. He had not had the time to deal with them. Chapter 611. Yu Chang was very happy. Originally, he had given up on himself and planned to waste 180 years here, but the changes in the depths of the ground made him see an opportunity. And Mingmei continued to advise. Master Yu Chang, you have to stop. If anything happens, we can't bear the responsibility. Yu Chang was extremely tired. This woman was really annoying. Were all the women of the Yin family so insensible? I have my own ideas. What responsibility do I need you to bear? Aren't you afraid that the wind will cut your tongue? Everything here is with me and the sacred mountain. What can happen? What a joke! Who knew that this time, and Mingmei would not compromise? You can be responsible for yourself and the sacred mountain, but I have to be responsible for the strange stone. I'm sorry, I will inform the 5 Elements sect and let them come to a conclusion. If they agree with your opinion, then I will do as I wish. And Mingmei was worried about her clansmen. If the strange stone's recovery failed, or if the loss worsened, with old clan leader and Chaodong deliberately destroying it, and her, and Mingmei, not doing her duty, it would be strange if the 5 Elements sect could give the Yin family a good result. Only by reporting and letting the people of the 5 Elements sect come to a decision would she have nothing to do with whether it was good or bad. This was her principle, and she had to uphold it. Up to you! Yu Chang did not care at all. Soon, the 5 Elements spiritual master arrived and asked for the opinions of both sides. After weighing the pros and cons, he chose to believe in the Yu Chang people. This was an inevitable choice. How would you choose between Jin Dan and Yuanying's opinions? How would you decide between the 3 pure ones who had fallen and the 3 pure ones who were at the peak of their power? Even a fool would understand something that did not need to be taught. And Mingmei was not disappointed and expressed that she would cooperate fully. To her, it was fine as long as the Yin family was not involved. As for what would happen in the future, what did it have to do with the Yin family? They had already given up the Thousand Chances Valley, so why would they care about the strange stone? As for whether it would return in the future, who knew? The people of the Fish Intestine tribe could finally use the 5 Elements Divine Mountain to effect the movement of the strange stone with great fanfare. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, because the strange stone's behavior was just like the fissures of the earth. There was no pattern to it, but the changes in the spiritual vigor came one wave after another. There were many types of fissures in the earth. When mortals could feel the earth shaking, it was already an extraordinary earthquake. In fact, this kind of situation was very rare. Most of the fissures were very frequent, and they were so slight that only cultivators could feel them. There were also some fissures that came from the depths of the earth, but even cultivators couldn't sense them. The only thing that could be sensed was the strange stones, which were the spiritual objects of the 5 elements that had been rooted in the earth for tens of thousands of years and had completely integrated with the surrounding terrain. The fish intestine people's judgment was not without reason. They had their own theoretical basis, but it was mixed with too much of the sect's selfish desires. They were unwilling to stop and miss out on such an opportunity. Since there was a loophole in the operation of the 5 elements of the strange stone, he naturally had to take advantage of it. Otherwise, when the crack stopped, where could he go to find such an opportunity? However, this would still be a long tug-of-war. After all, the strange stone's 5 elements were there. What he hoped to do was to open up as many openings as possible before the fissures stopped, so as to provide convenient conditions for the invasion of the 5 elements' divine mountain. In order to do this, the fish intestine tribe took a bit of a risk. They were more unrestrained in the operation of the 5 elements. This was because he was very clear that these spiritual objects of the heaven and earth did not have any bad intentions. Only humans had bad intentions. Since he was not facing humans now, why should he care about the rules and regulations of the operation of the 5 elements? Even Mei was a little surprised by his boldness. This was almost a type of wanton invasion. He completely unleashed the power of the 5 elements' divine mountain, but he also completely exposed himself, and did not guard against it. They didn't know that the strange stone naturally did not have any bad intentions, but the strange stone that was controlled by a certain swordsman might not be. It was holding back its evil intentions. Lu Xiaoyi had his own plan on how to take the initiative to produce a sword spirit, and that was to turn the spirits of the 5 elements into sword spirits. In this world, some spiritual objects could produce spiritual intelligence, while some could not. This was not absolute. One of the most important things was that the higher the quality of a spiritual object, the more it could produce spiritual intelligence. This was a cognitive misconception. For example, the 5 elements divine mountain and the strange stone were spiritual objects that were born with the heaven and earth. There was no need to talk about their quality, and there was no need to talk about the Tao realm that they contained. For spiritual objects like this, it was very difficult for them to produce true spiritual intelligence. The reason was very simple. If they had produced spiritual intelligence, what realm should they be placed in? Would the old ancestor of the 33 heavens, who had merged with the great Tao of the 5 elements, be able to sit still? Therefore, these 2 spiritual objects of the heaven and earth only had the instinctive spirituality of each element. They could not be called spiritual intelligence yet. For example, the divine mountain had the spirituality of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. They relied on each other and competed with each other. Under the balance, no one could make the decision. They could only stay at the spiritual level and could not produce independent consciousness. Lu Xiaoyi's idea was to seize these 5 spiritualities and produce his own 5 elements sword spirit. However, he had to think clearly about how to do it. In terms of strategy, he could be very bold, but in terms of tactics, he had to be very careful. In his original plan, cultivating the 5 elements sword spirit was the same as before. First, he would refine 5 flying swords of each element, and then wait for the rabbit to come out. Now it seemed that if he really released these 5 flying swords, the possibility of being discovered by the cultivator controlling the 5 elements divine mountain was too high. Because these 5 flying swords did not have a sword spirit. If he wanted to sneak into the strange stone and do something, he would definitely be suspected. He could only use his divine sense to control the swords. Once his divine sense was released, the cultivators outside would immediately sense it. Especially if this Yuanying was outside, she would immediately be exposed. Therefore, he could not release these 5 flying swords. He could only release his own sword spirit. It was formless and intangible. It could pretend to be the spirit of the 5 elements of the strange stone and lure the spirit of the divine mountain to devour it. Then, he could capture it. Finally, he could take the spirit of the 5 elements and stuff it into the 5 flying swords he had already prepared. There was a high probability that a new sword spirit would be born. This was a kind of inference, and also a kind of guess. No one had ever done this before, so he did not know whether it would succeed or not. However, the path of cultivation was a path of constant innovation. If he walked step by step, he would only become ordinary. As a prerequisite for his preparations, he began to methodically release his sword spirits. Because they had their own intelligence, he did not need to use his divine sense to control them. This avoided the possibility of being discovered. The 4 seasons, Zhu Cheng, Water Army, Hidden Fragrance, and Wu Shen were these 5 sword spirits. The Big Dipper sword spirit belonged to the star element, and was not related to the 5 elements. Not to mention the Luck Cutter, it belonged to the fate element, and was very cold. In his opinion, the 4 seasons sword spirit was an inert sword spirit, and was related to the earth element. It could be used to capture earth element spirits. Zhu Qing was sharp and could capture metal. Water Army was needless to say. Although it was a thunder spirit, its main body was a water element flying sword. It could only be used to capture water spirits. Hidden Fragrance and Wu Shen did not have any attributes. He could only use whichever he encountered. He only had these 7 sword spirits, and could only make do. There was nothing he could do. You're tuning into the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.